When Lillian Hayes's trembling voice asked for work at a stranger's ranch, she expected charity or rejection, never a marriage proposal from a man she'd just met. "I don't need a servant," the cowboy said, his eyes holding secrets of their own. "I need a wife." In 1875, Wyoming, a desperate woman running from her past and a lonely rancher guarding his future collided at a wooden gate, beginning a story that would test whether two broken souls could heal each other. Stay until the end to discover how their journey unfolds, and comment your city below so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The sun hung low over the Wyoming territory like a bleeding wound, casting long shadows across the prairie grass that bent and swayed in the relentless wind. Lillian Hayes had been walking for 3 days straight, her feet blistered and raw inside boots that had given up their soles somewhere back near the Colorado border. Each step sent a fresh jolt of pain up her legs, but pain was something she'd learned to embrace. It meant she was still alive, still moving, still 1 mile further from the nightmare she'd left behind in St. Louis. Her grey traveling dress, once modest and respectable, now hung on her frame like a funeral shroud, stained with dust and sweat, and the desperate miles of a woman with nowhere left to go. The shawl around her shoulders, her mother's shawl, the only thing she'd managed to grab before fleeing, was threadbare and offered little protection against the biting spring wind that swept down from the mountains. Her dark hair, once pinned neatly beneath a bonnet, now straggled around her face in wild tendrils that whipped and tangled with each gust. Lillian had stopped looking at her reflection in streams days ago. She knew what she'd see. Hollow cheeks, eyes too large for her face, the pale complexion of someone who'd forgotten what safety felt like. At 23, she looked a decade older, aged by fear and exhaustion and the weight of decisions that couldn't be unmade. The ranch appeared on the horizon like a mirage. First just a dark smudge against the golden landscape, then gradually resolving into buildings, fences, the promise of civilization in a wilderness that had tried its best to swallow her whole. Lillian's heart hammered against her ribs as she forced her protesting legs to carry her forward. This was the fourth ranch she'd approached in as many days. The first had set their dogs on her. The second had offered her a meal and directions to the nearest town 20 miles north. The third had been abandoned, nothing but empty buildings and ghosts. This one looked lived in. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, horses moved in a corral, their coats gleaming in the fading light. A large barn stood solid and red against the landscape, and the main house, 2 stories of weathered wood with a wide porch, spoke of prosperity, or at least survival in a land that devoured the weak. Lillian approached the wooden gate that marked the boundary between the open range and someone's claimed life. Her hand shook as she reached for the latch, then stopped. For a long moment she stood there, frozen by a fear that had nothing to do with rejection and everything to do with hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope could break you worse than any cruelty. "Please," she whispered to herself, rehearsing words that had failed her before. "I'm looking for work. Any work. I can cook, clean, mend." The barn door swung open with a creak that carried across the yard, and Lillian's breath caught in her throat. A man emerged, tall and broad-shouldered, silhouetted against the darkness of the interior like something carved from the mountains themselves. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew every inch of his land, who'd never had to question whether he belonged somewhere. Colt Mercer had been breaking horses since before dawn, and his shirt clung to his back with honest sweat. At 35, he wore his years in the lines around his eyes and the silver threading through his dark hair. But there was a vitality to him that the hard life hadn't managed to beat down. He'd been wiping his hands on a rag when he caught movement at the gate. Something that didn't belong, out of place in the familiar rhythm of his evening routine. A woman alone, looking half dead on her feet. Colt's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle he kept near the barn door, but something stopped him. The way she stood there, swaying slightly, one hand gripping the fence post like it was all that kept her upright. This wasn't a threat. This was someone in trouble. He tossed the rag aside and started across the yard, his boots crunching on the hard-packed earth. As he got closer, he could see her more clearly, young despite the exhaustion etched into every line of her body. Pretty in that fragile, way of wild things that might bolt at any moment, and scared. Lord, was she scared. It radiated off her like heat. "You've found my place," Colt said, keeping his voice even, non-threatening. He stopped a respectful distance away, not wanting to spook her further. "Name's Colt Mercer." Lillian had been prepared for anger, for dismissal, for the door slamming in her face before she could even finish her plea. She hadn't been prepared for kindness, or for the man himself. He was rougher than the saintless gentleman she'd known, weathered by sun and wind and a life spent outdoors. But there was something in his dark eyes that made her throat tighten. Not pity, she couldn't have borne pity, but recognition, as if he understood what it meant to be standing at someone else's gate with nothing but desperation to recommend you. "Please," she said, and hated how her voice shook, how small she sounded. She clutched her small travel bag, barely more than a satchel containing everything she owned in the world, and forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'm looking for work. I can cook, mend, clean, anything. I'll work hard, I promise. I just need—" She faltered, the words catching in her throat. What did she need? Shelter, safety, a place where her stepfather's rage couldn't reach her. "I just need somewhere to stay," she finished quietly. Colt studied her for a long moment, and Lillian felt herself being measured in a way that had nothing to do with her appearance. He was looking at her hands, work roughened despite their current trembling, at her stance, straight back despite the obvious exhaustion, at her eyes, proud even now. This wasn't some pampered city girl playing at frontier life. This was someone who'd already survived things that would have broken lesser people. He'd been alone on this ranch for 5 years, ever since his wife died in childbirth, along with the son he'd never got to hold. The house had been empty since then, echoing with ghosts and might have been. His men were good workers, but they kept to the bunkhouse, and at night the main house felt like a tomb. He told himself he preferred it that way, that he'd had his chance at happiness, and it wasn't coming around again. But looking at this woman standing at his gate, trembling with exhaustion and fear and stubborn courage, something shifted in Colt's chest. Something that had been frozen for 5 long years began to crack. "Miss," he said slowly, carefully, weighing each word before he spoke it. "I appreciate you coming all this way, and I can see you're in need, but I've got to be honest with you." He paused, watching her brace for rejection, seeing her shoulders tense and her fingers tighten on that pitiful bag. "I don't need a servant." The words hit Lillian like a physical blow. Of course, she'd been foolish to hope, foolish to think, "I need a wife." The world seemed to stop turning. The wind died. The horses in the corral went silent. Lillian's ears rang with the impossibility of what she'd just heard. "What?" The word came out as barely a whisper. Colt didn't flinch from her stare. "You heard me right. I'm not looking for hired help, Miss Hayes." She supplied automatically, her mind reeling. "Lillian Hayes. Miss Hayes." He nodded as if they were discussing something as ordinary as the weather, as mundane as the price of cattle. "This ranch is prosperous. I've got 4 good men working for me, and we manage fine with the day-to-day. But a ranch isn't a home without a woman to make it one. I'm not getting any younger, and I'm tired of eating beans from a can and sleeping in an empty house." Lillian's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. This couldn't be real. Men didn't propose to complete strangers, men didn't. But even as she thought it, she knew that out here on the frontier, the rules were different. Women were scarce. Loneliness was abundant, and sometimes survival required unconventional arrangements. "You don't even know me," she managed, her voice stronger now, sharpened by shock, into something approaching her normal self. "I could be anyone. I could be on the run," Colt finished for her and watched her eyes widen. "I've got eyes, Miss Hayes. You didn't walk all this way from the nearest town just for the scenery. You're running from something, and you're running hard." He held up a hand before she could speak. "I'm not asking what. That's your business. But I am a decent judge of character, and I can see you're not running from the law. You're running from something personal, something that hurt you." Tears pricked at Lillian's eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. She would not cry. She would not break down in front of this stranger who seemed to see straight through all her carefully constructed walls. "I don't know you either," Colt continued, his voice gentler now. "But I know you've got courage." Takes courage to walk up to a stranger's door and ask for help. I know you've got pride. You're asking for work, not charity. And I know you've survived something that would have killed a weaker person. He paused, then added quietly, "That's enough for me." "This is insane," Lillian breathed. But there was something in her chest. Hope again. That dangerous, treacherous thing beginning to uncurl like a flower after rain. "You can't be serious." "I'm dead serious, Miss Hayes, but I'm not a fool, and I'm not asking you to decide right now." Colt gestured toward the barn. "There's a room above the stable. It's clean, warm, got a decent bed and a stove. Stay the night, rest, get your feet under you. In the morning, we can talk properly about what I'm proposing, and you can decide if it's something you'd consider, or if you'd rather I point you toward the nearest town where you might find more traditional employment." It was the reasonableness of it that undid her. Not pressure, not demands, just a simple offer of shelter and time to think. Lillian felt something inside her that had been wound tight for weeks begin to loosen. "I don't have any money," she said, because she needed him to understand exactly how desperate her situation was. "I can't pay you for lodging." "Didn't ask you to." Colt's expression didn't change. "Come on, I'll show you to the room, and then I'll have one of the men bring you some dinner. You look like you haven't eaten properly in days." He turned and started toward the barn, clearly expecting her to follow. Lillian stood frozen for another moment, every instinct screaming at her to run. But where she had nowhere left to go, no friends in this territory, no far, no family that cared, no money to her name. Behind her was danger. Ahead was what? A stranger's kindness. A proposal so outlandish it couldn't possibly be real. Or maybe, just maybe, a chance. She took a deep breath, adjusted her grip on her bag, and pushed open the gate. The barn was enormous, far larger than she'd expected, with a dozen stalls and a hoft that stretched toward rafters, lost in shadows. The smell hit her immediately, horse and leather and fresh hay. Not unpleasant, oddly comforting in its familiarity. This was a working space, well maintained and organized, with a precision that spoke of a man who took pride in his property. Colt led her to a narrow staircase at the back of the barn, the wooden steps worn smooth by years of use. At the top was a door which he pushed open to reveal a small but surprisingly cozy room. A single bed with a simple quilt, a small cast-iron stove, a washstand with a chipped basin and pitcher, a wooden chair beside a tiny table. A single window looked out over the darkening prairie, and someone, Colt, she assumed, had already laid a fire in the stove, ready to be lit. "It's not fancy," Colt said, standing in the doorway, his bulk blocking most of the light from below. "But it's warm and dry and private. Door has a lock on the inside. You can use it if it makes you feel safer. No one will bother you up here." Lillian stepped into the room and felt something inside her crack wide open. It was the smallest thing, just a room, just four walls and a bed. But after 3 days of sleeping rough, of never knowing if she'd wake to find her stepfather looming over her, it looked like paradise. "Thank you," she whispered, not trusting her voice any louder. Colt nodded. "I'll send someone up with food in a bit. There's water in the pitcher and there's a pump out behind the barn if you need more. Outhouse is about 20 yards to the left as you leave the barn. You'll see it if you need anything during the night. The main house is the big building to the south. I'm a light sleeper." He turned to go, then paused, looking back at her. In the dim light filtering through the window, his face was all planes and angles, weathered and strong. "Miss Hayes, I meant what I said about needing a wife, not a servant. I'm not looking for someone to work themselves to death keeping my house. I'm looking for a partner, someone to build something with. Think on that tonight." Then he was gone, his boots heavy on the stairs, leaving Lillian alone in the little room above the barn with a decision that could change everything. She sank onto the bed, and it was so soft, so blessedly soft after nights on the hard ground, that she almost sobbed with relief. Her hands shook as she unlaced her ruined boots and peeled them off, revealing feet that were blistered and bleeding. She should tend to them, should wash, should prepare herself for whatever came next. Instead, she lay back on the quilt and stared at the ceiling, her mind spinning. A wife. He wanted a wife. Not a housekeeper or a cook or a hired girl. A wife, a partner. The word echoed in her head, strange and foreign and terrifying. Lillian had never expected to marry. She'd been her mother's caretaker from the age of 15, nursing her through the wasting sickness that had taken 3 years to kill her. After her mother's death, she'd become her father's housekeeper, trying desperately to hold together a household that was crumbling around them. When her father remarried, desperate for companionship, she'd thought, though now she knew better, Lillian had tried to welcome her stepfather into their lives. Marcus Webb had seemed charming at first, attentive, generous. He'd brought gifts and told stories and made her father laugh for the first time since her mother's death. It wasn't until after the wedding that his true nature revealed itself. The first time he'd cornered her in the hallway, his hand sliding up her arm, his breath hot and whiskey sour against her neck. Lillian had frozen in shock. When she told her father, he'd dismissed her concerns. Marcus is just being friendly, he'd said, tired and worn down by years of grief. Don't be dramatic. The second time she'd fought back, earning herself a bruise that she'd hidden beneath her sleeve and a warning that if she caused trouble, her father would suffer for it. The third time she'd packed a bag and run. That had been 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks of traveling west, using the last of her saved money for trains and stagecoaches until the money ran out and she'd had to walk. 3 weeks of looking over her shoulder, certain that Marcus would come after her because men like Marcus didn't let their property escape so easily. And that's what she'd been to him. Property. Now here she was in a stranger's barn, contemplating an offer of marriage from a man she'd known for less than an hour. It was madness. And yet Colt Mercer hadn't looked at her the way Marcus had. There had been no hunger in his eyes, no predatory calculation. He'd looked at her like she was a person, not a prize. He'd offered her shelter with no strings attached, a locked door. Time to think. A knock at the door made her bolt upright, heart hammering. Miss Hayes. An unfamiliar voice, young and hesitant. Mr. Mercer sent me up with some dinner for you, ma'am. Lillian crossed to the door and opened it a crack, still not quite trusting. A boy stood there. Couldn't be more than 17, sandy-haired and freckled, holding a covered tray that smelled like heaven. Name's Tommy, ma'am, he said, ducking his head shilly. I help out in the bunkhouse kitchen. Mr. Mercer said you might be hungry. Thank you, Tommy. Lillian took the tray, feeling the weight of it, the solid reality of food and care and kindness. That's very kind of you. Yes, ma'am. Tommy turned to go, then hesitated. Mr. Mercer's a good man, miss. Best boss I ever had. Fair and honest. Never asks more than he's willing to give. Just thought you should know. He disappeared down the stairs before Lillian could respond, leaving her holding the tray and blinking back tears that kept threatening to fall. She set the tray on the small table and lifted the cloth. Roast beef still warm, potatoes, fresh bread with butter, a jar of milk, and a slice of dried apple pie. It was more food than she'd seen in a week, and she had to force herself to eat slowly to not make herself sick after days of near starvation. As she ate, she watched the sun set through her window, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson and deep purple. This land was harsh, unforgiving, beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. It was so different from St. Louis, from the cramped streets and smoke-stained buildings and the constant press of people. Here there was space, air, room to breathe, room to become someone new. When the food was gone and darkness had settled over the ranch like a blanket, Lillian finally rose to wash. The water in the pitcher was cold but clean, and she scrubbed her face and hands and feet, wincing at the sting of soap in her blisters. In her bag, she found the one clean nightgown she'd managed to pack, plain white cotton, worn soft from years of use, and changed into it, hanging her travel-stained dress on the back of the chair. She should sleep. God knew she needed it, but her mind wouldn't quiet, wouldn't stop turning over Colt Mercer's words, analyzing them from every angle. I need a wife. Not want, need. As if marriage were a practical consideration, like needing a horse to plow a field or a roof to keep out the rain. And maybe that's exactly what it was out here on the frontier. Not romance or passion or the fairy tales her mother had once told her, but survival, partnership, two people choosing to face the world together because it was easier than facing it alone. Could she do that? Could she bind her life to a stranger's, knowing nothing about him except that he'd shown her one evening of unexpected kindness? The alternative was finding another ranch, Another town, always looking over her shoulder for Marcus Webb's angry face, always waiting for the moment when he'd finally track her down and drag her back to St. Louis, or worse, take his revenge right there on the spot. She had no illusions about what Marcus was capable of. She'd seen the rage in his eyes when she defied him, had felt the bruising strength of his hands. At least here with Colt Mercer, she'd have protection, a name that wasn't Webb, a place to call home, even if that home came with conditions she didn't fully understand yet. Think on that tonight, he'd said. So she thought long into the night as the stars wheeled overhead and the sounds of the ranch settled into evening quiet. Horses nickering softly, the distant call of a coyote, the creak of wood adjusting to the cooler air. Lily and Hayes lay in a stranger's bed and contemplated a future she'd never imagined. Sleep, when it finally came, was deep and dreamless. For the first time in 3 weeks, she didn't wake gasping from nightmares. For the first time since fleeing St. Louis, she slept through the night without fear. When dawn broke, pink and gold, through her window, Lillian opened her eyes to find herself still in the little room above the barn. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was, and panic clawed at her throat. But then memory returned, and with it a strange sort of calm. She had a decision to make. Rising, she dressed carefully in her least damaged dress, navy cotton with small white buttons. Not fashionable, but clean and respectable. She pinned her hair as best she could without a proper mirror, using the reflection in the window to check that she looked presentable. Her mother had always said that you should face important moments with dignity, with your head held high and your appearance neat. It was one of the few pieces of advice Lillian had managed to hold on to through everything that came after. Outside the ranch was already alive with activity. She could hear voices from the bunkhouse, the sound of horses being led to pasture, the ring of a hammer on an anvil. The working day had begun, and she was standing in her room like a coward, afraid to go down and face the consequences of last night's impossible offer. Courage, she whispered to herself, her mother's word, her mother's voice. You have more courage than you know. She descended the stairs carefully, her sore feet protesting each step. The barn was full of morning light now, dust motes dancing in the shafts of sun that slanted through the windows. A few horses turned to look at her with mild interest before returning to their hay. Outside, she spotted Colt immediately. He was by the corral talking with a man who looked to be in his 50s, both of them gesturing toward a group of horses. He saw her emerge from the barn and raised a hand in acknowledgement, but didn't immediately approach. Giving her space, she realized, not pressuring her. It was that small gesture, that respect for her autonomy, that made her decision for her. Lillian crossed the yard, her worn boots crunching on the packed earth, her heart hammering, but her steps steady. Colt turned to face her fully as she approached, and in the morning light she could see him more clearly than she had the night before. The lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun. The strength in his hands and shoulders, the result of hard physical labor, the weariness in his expression that mirrored her own, as if he too had learned to be careful with hope. Miss Hayes, he said quietly, did you sleep? Yes. It came out steadier than she expected, better than I have in weeks. He nodded slowly. I'm glad. Would you like some coffee? Breakfast? We can talk properly if you're ready. I'm ready. She took a breath, steadying herself. But first I need to know something, Mr. Mercer. Ask why. The word hung between them, heavy with all the unspoken questions it contained. Why me? Why now? Why would you offer marriage to a complete stranger? Colt was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving past her to the prairie beyond, to the endless sweep of land and sky. When he spoke, his voice was low and honest, and tinged with a loneliness that made her chest ache. 5 years ago, I had a wife, Sarah. She died in childbirth along with our son. He paused and Lillian saw his throat work. Since then, this ranch has been my whole world. I wake up, I work, I sleep. The days blur together, the men are good company, but at night he trailed off, then met her eyes again. At night the house is empty, and I remember what it was like to have someone to share things with, to talk to build a life alongside. I'm sorry, Lillian said softly, meaning it. So am I. Colt's smile was sad, but genuine. I'm not looking to replace Sarah. No one could. But I'm tired of living in the past. I want a future again, Miss Hayes. And when I saw you standing at my gate yesterday, looking like you'd walked through hell, but were still standing, still fighting, I thought maybe you were looking for a future too. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. No pretense, no games, just raw truth laid bare in the morning sun. And God help her, it was exactly what she needed to hear. I am, she admitted, running from my past, looking for somewhere I can just be without fear. Then maybe we can help each other. Colt held out his hand, not in demand but in offering. I'm not asking for your answer right now, Miss Hayes. Stay a few days. Get to know the place. Get to know me. See if this is somewhere you could make a home. If it's not, I'll give you money for a train ticket to wherever you want to go. No obligations, no strings, but if you think it might work, he left the sentence unfinished, hanging in the air between them like a promise. Lillian looked at his outstretched hand, work roughened, scarred, steady, and thought about trust, about second chances, about the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of starting over. She reached out and placed her hand in his. I'll stay, she said, for a few days. To see. Colt's smile transformed his face, erasing years and worry and grief, leaving behind something that looked almost like joy. That's all I'm asking, Miss Hayes, he said. That's more than enough. The days that followed unfolded with a rhythm Lillian hadn't expected. Steady, purposeful, surprisingly gentle. That first morning, after their conversation by the corral, Colt had introduced her to his men with a simple directness that left no room for misunderstanding. This is Miss Lillian Hayes, he'd said, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder, a gesture of protection, not possession. She'll be staying with us for a while. I expect you all to treat her with respect. The 4 ranch hands had nodded, some curious, some indifferent, but all accepting. Tommy, the young man who'd brought her dinner the night before, had grinned openly. An older man named Dutch, grizzled and bow-legged from decades in the saddle, had tipped his hat and muttered something about it being high time the main house had a woman's touch again. The other 2, brothers named Jake and Michael Sullivan, had simply welcomed her with easy smiles before returning to their work. No one asked questions. No one demanded explanations. In the West, Lillian was learning a person's past was their own business, and privacy was respected like water in a drought, precious and not to be wasted. That first day, Lillian had moved through the ranch with careful steps, learning its geography and rhythm. The main house stood proud at the center of it all, 2 stories of solid construction with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Inside, she found exactly what Colt had described, a home that functioned but didn't live. The kitchen was clean but sparse, the parlor neat but empty of the small touches that made a house feel inhabited. Upstairs, she glimpsed closed doors that Colt didn't offer to open, and she didn't ask. That was Sarah's sewing room, he'd said quietly, nodding toward one door. Haven't been in there since, well, haven't been in there. Lillian had understood immediately. Some doors were meant to stay closed until the person behind them was ready to open them. She knew about that. Had her own closed doors, her own rooms she couldn't bear to enter. The kitchen became her domain almost immediately. Not because Colt asked, but because Lillian needed something to do with her hands, some way to contribute that felt less like charity and more like earning her keep. She'd found the pantry surprisingly well stocked. Flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, salt pork, canned goods. The men had been surviving on simple fare, but there was enough here to make real meals if someone cared to try. That first lunch, she'd made stew from salt pork and dried vegetables, biscuits from flour, and the precious butter she'd found in the cold cellar. Nothing fancy, but hot and filling, and served with care. The men had eaten with the single-minded focus of people who'd gotten used to food being fuel rather than pleasure. But she'd caught Colt's eye across the table and seen something there. Gratitude, maybe, or recognition. Haven't had biscuits like this since my mother passed, Dutch had said, reaching for his third. Light as air, Miss Hayes. You've got a gift. She ducked her head to hide her flush of pleasure. It had been so long since anyone had praised something she'd done, had seen value in her beyond what she could provide or endure. The work came naturally after that, not because she felt obligated, but because idle hands left too much room for thinking, and thinking led to remembering. And remembering led to the dark spiral of fear that Marcus might somehow find her even here, hundreds of miles from St. Louis. So she worked, scrubbing floors that didn't really need scrubbing, mending clothes that had languished in a basket for months, baking bread that filled the house with warmth and the yeasty smell of home. Colt watched her with those steady, dark eyes, but he never commanded, never demanded. If she asked where something was kept, he told her. If she needed supplies from town, he made a list and sent Jake and Michael in the wagon. But he never once treated her like hired help, and he never once presumed on the tentative arrangement between them. At night, she returned to her room above the barn, and Colt bid her good night from the porch of the main house with a tip of his hat and nothing more. The locked door was hers to use or not, and she found herself using it less as the days passed and no threat materialized, as the ranch proved itself to be exactly what Colt had promised, a place of safety. On the third day, she found him in the barn before dawn, preparing to ride out to check the herd in the far pasture. She'd come down early, unable to sleep, drawn by the lamplight spilling from the barn doors. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, cinching his saddle with practiced efficiency. "Too quiet," she admitted, then immediately felt foolish. "I know that sounds strange. Doesn't sound strange at all." Colt checked his saddlebags, his hands moving through the familiar routine. "I remember when I first came west from Pennsylvania. The silence nearly drove me mad. No street vendors calling out, no wagon wheels on cobblestones, no church bells every hour, just space takes getting used to." "How long did it take you?" Lillian asked, moving closer to stroke the nose of his horse, a big bay geeling with kind eyes. "About a month," he smiled slightly. "Then one morning I woke up and realized I couldn't imagine living anywhere else. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of things I'd never heard before: wind in the grass, hawks calling, cattle lowing in the distance. A whole different kind of music." Lillian considered this, running her hand down the horse's neck. "I think I'm starting to hear it." Something shifted in Colt's expression, a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Good," he said softly, then after a pause, "Would you like to come with me today? I'm just riding the boundary, checking fences and looking for early calves. It's a long ride, but the country is beautiful this time of year." Her first instinct was to refuse. She had work to do, bread to bake, floors to sweep, but something in his careful invitation, in the way he offered it without pressure or expectation, made her reconsider. When was the last time she'd done something simply because she wanted to? When had she last allowed herself pleasure without guilt? "I'd like that," she heard herself say, "but I should warn you, I'm not much of a rider." "That's all right. Daisy's gentle as a lamb." He nodded toward a dappled grey mare in the nearest stall. "She'll take care of you." Within 20 minutes, Lillian found herself in the saddle for the first time in years, her hands gripping the pommel, perhaps a bit too tightly, her seat uncertain, but gradually steadying. Colt led the way out of the ranch yard as the sun broke over the horizon, painting the world in shades of gold and rose that took her breath away. They rode in companionable silence at first, Colt occasionally pointing out landmarks: the creek that marked the western boundary of his property, the stand of cottonwoods where he'd built Sarah's grave, the rocky outcropping where eagles nested each spring. His voice when he spoke of Sarah was matter-of-fact, tinged with old grief, but no longer raw with it. He'd learned to carry his loss, Lillian realized, the way one carries an old injury that aches in bad weather but no longer cripples. "Do you mind talking about her?" Lillian asked after he'd fallen silent. Worried she'd overstepped. "No." Colt's answer came quick and sure. Sarah was real. She lived. She mattered. Pretending she didn't exist doesn't honor her memory. It erases it. I loved her. She loved me. And we had 3 good years before we lost her. That's more than some people get. "That's a healthy way to look at it," Lillian said quietly. "Some people get lost in grief. I did for a while." He was quiet for a moment, guiding his horse, around a patch of loose rocks. "First year after she died, I barely left the ranch, barely spoke. The men didn't know what to do with me. I was like a ghost, just going through motions." Dutch finally sat me down one night, forced a bottle of whiskey on me, and said Sarah would box my ears if she could see me wasting away like this. Said she'd want me to live and not just survive. He sounds like a wise man. He's ornery as hell and twice as stubborn, but yeah, he's wise. Colt's smile was genuine now. What about you, Miss Hayes? You mentioned running from your past. You willing to talk about it, or should I respect the silence? Lillian's hands tightened on the res, and Daisy nickered softly, responding to the tension. She forced herself to relax, to breathe, to remember that Colt had been nothing but honest with her and perhaps deserved honesty in return. My mother died when I was 18, she began, the words coming slowly, carefully. My father remarried 2 years later. I thought he was lonely. I thought he needed companionship. I didn't realize what kind of man Marcus Webb really was. Colt said nothing, but she could feel his attention sharpen, his posture in the saddle shifting almost imperceptibly toward her. At first he was charming, attentive, but after the wedding she stopped, swallowed hard. He began to see me as part of the property my father had acquired along with the house. When I resisted, when I told my father, Marcus made it clear that any trouble I caused would result in consequences. Not for me, for my father. And my father was old, Mr. Mercer, tired, worn down by grief and age. He couldn't have withstood Marcus's anger. So you ran. It wasn't a question. So I ran, she confirmed, her voice barely audible over the sound of hoof-beats and wind. 3 weeks ago, in the middle of the night, I took what money I'd managed to hide away, a change of clothes and my mother's shawl. I didn't leave a note. I just left. And you think he's looking for you? I know he is. Lillian's certainty was absolute. Marcus doesn't let go of things he considers his. He'll have told my father I ran off with some unsuitable man, or that I've lost my mind, or some other lie that makes him the victim. And he'll be searching. Men like Marcus always search. Colt was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and absolutely steady. Miss Hayes, Lillian, I want you to understand something. If you choose to stay here, if you choose to accept my proposal, you'll be under my protection. That's not just words, that's a promise. Marcus Webb or any other man who means you harm would have to go through me first. And I'm not an easy man to go through. The certainty in his voice, the absolute conviction, made Lillian's eyes burn with unshed tears. You barely know me, she whispered. Why would you stand between me and danger like that? Because it's the right thing to do. He turned in his saddle to look at her directly, and the morning sun caught his face just so, illuminating the strength there, the integrity. Because no woman should have to run from a man who's supposed to protect her. Because if I'm asking you to be my wife, even in name only, then that means something. It means I stand between you and harm. It means you're safe here for as long as you choose to stay. In name only, Lillian repeated, catching on the phrase. Colt's expression didn't waver. I'm proposing marriage, Lillian. But I'm not proposing to force myself on you. If you say yes, you'll have your own room, your own space, your own life. What happens between us beyond that, if anything happens, will be because we both choose it when we're both ready, not before. The relief that flooded through her was so intense it made her dizzy. She'd been so afraid, not of Colt specifically, but of what marriage meant, what men expected, what Marcus had tried to take. That hearing him say those words was like being given permission to breathe again. Thank you, she managed, her voice thick. You don't know what that means to me. I think I might, he said gently, then with a slight smile. Now you want to see where the creek widens into a swimming hole? It's one of the prettiest spots on the property. The rest of the ride passed in easier conversation. Colt pointed out the different grasses, explained the work of managing a cattle ranch, told her stories about the land and its history. He'd bought this property 7 years ago, he explained, when it was nothing but open range and possibility. He'd built the house with his own hands, with Sarah beside him choosing paint colors and window placements. He'd survived droughts and hard winters, and the constant challenge of making a life in a place that didn't give up its bounties easily. Why here? Lillian asked as they paused at the top of a ridge, looking out over the vast sweep of his land. Why Wyoming instead of somewhere easier? Because easy never made anyone strong, Colt replied. And because when I first saw this valley, something in me just knew. This was home. This was where I was meant to build something that mattered. Lillian understood that in a way she couldn't quite articulate. She'd spent so much of her life in places that didn't feel like home. Her father's house after her mother died, the house that became Marcus's domain, the endless road west, where every town was just another temporary stopping point. But here, on this ridge, with the wind in her face and the valley spread below like a promise, she felt something shift inside her. Not certainty, not yet, but possibility. They returned to the ranch as the sun reached its zenith, both of them wind-worn and hungry. Lillian excused herself to wash and change while Colt tended to the horses, and by the time she'd made her way to the main house kitchen, she found him already there pumping water at the sink with his sleeves rolled up. "I thought I'd make us lunch," she said, suddenly shy in the domestic intimacy of the moment. "I'd appreciate that." Colt dried his hands and leaned against the counter, watching her move around the kitchen with growing familiarity. "You settling in all right? Room above the barn, comfortable enough?" "It's fine, Muscle," Lillian assured him, pulling out ingredients for sandwiches, leftover beef from last night's dinner, fresh bread she'd baked yesterday, the last of the tomatoes from the cold cellar. More than fine, actually. "It's but," Colt prompted when she hesitated. Lillian bit her lip, assembling sandwiches with careful precision. "It feels temporary," she admitted, "like I'm a guest passing through, not someone who belongs." Colt was quiet for a moment. "The main house has 4 bedrooms upstairs," he said finally. "I use one. Sarah's sewing room is another. The third is just storage now, boxes and furniture we never quite knew what to do with. The fourth," he paused. "The fourth was going to be the nursery." Lillian's hand still illed on the bread knife. "It's empty now," Colt continued, his voice carefully neutral. "Has been for 5 years. But it's got a good bed, a wardrobe, a window that looks east toward the sunrise, a fireplace for winter. If you wanted, if you felt like you could, you'd be welcome to take that room. Make it yours." The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. It was more than just a change of sleeping quarters. It was an invitation into his life, into his home, into the possibility of something permanent. "I don't want to intrude," Lillian said softly, even though everything in her yearned toward the idea of a real room, a real home, a real chance at belonging. "You wouldn't be." Colt met her eyes steadily. "Lillian, I'm not asking you to make a decision about marriage right now. I said a few days and I meant it. But if you're going to seriously consider my proposal, if you're going to figure out whether this could work, then you should live as you would if you said yes. Not in a room above the barn like a temporary ranch hand, but in the house as someone who belongs here." The logic was sound, but more than that, the invitation was genuine. She could see it in his face, in the way he held himself, open, honest, waiting for her answer without pressure or demand. "All right," Lillian heard herself say. "Yes, I'd like that." The smile that broke across Colt's face was like sunrise, slow, warm, transforming everything it touched. "Good," he said simply. "After lunch, I'll help you move your things." They ate together at the kitchen table, and for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Lillian felt herself begin to relax in his presence. Colt wasn't like any man she'd known before. Not like her father, worn down by life and unable to protect her. Not like Marcus, all charm concealing cruelty. He was solid, straightforward, comfortable in his own skin in a way that made her feel less anxious in hers. "Tell me something," she said as they finished eating. "Why didn't you go looking for a wife in town? Surely there are women in the nearest settlement who would have jumped at the chance to marry a prosperous rancher." Colt smiled wryly. "There's exactly 4 unmarried women in Copper Springs, and I've known 3 of them since they were girls. Feels wrong somehow, like proposing to my nieces. The 4th is the banker's daughter, and she's made it clear she has no interest in ranch life. Wants to move back east, marry a city man with soft hands and a regular paycheck. So you decided to wait for someone desperate enough to show up at your gate." Lillian's tone was teasing, but there was real curiosity beneath it. "I decided to wait for someone who needed what I could offer as much as I needed what they could offer," Colt corrected gently. "Not desperation, Lillian. Compatibility, mutual benefit, Two people choosing each other because it makes sense for both of them, not because one has power over the other. It was such a reasonable, pragmatic view of marriage. And yet beneath it, Lillian sensed something deeper. A loneliness that matched her own, a desire for connection, for partnership, for the simple human comfort of not facing life alone. I understand, she said quietly. I think I'm starting to understand very well. After lunch, Colt insisted on accompanying her to the barn to help gather her meager belongings. It took all of 5 minutes. She had so little that it barely filled the small satchel she'd carried from St. Louis. Her extra dress, a nightgown, the few undergarments she'd managed to pack, her mother's shawl, a hairbrush with half its bristles missing. The sum total of her life reduced to things that could fit in a bag small enough to carry one-handed. Colt looked at the pitiful pile, and something flickered across his face. Not pity, but a kind of fierce protectiveness that made Lillian's breath catch. "We'll go to town next week," he said firmly. "Get you some proper clothes, things you need before you argue." He held up a hand as she opened her mouth to protest. "Consider it an advance on your decision. If you choose to stay, you'll need more than one dress. If you choose to go, you'll need supplies for traveling. Either way, it's practical, not charity." Lillian wanted to argue, but the truth was, her clothes were falling apart, and she had no money to replace them. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. "All right," she agreed, "but I keep track. If I choose to leave, I'll pay you back somehow." "Fair enough." Colt picked up her bag with one hand, as if it weighed nothing. "Come on, let me show you your room." The main house felt different entering it this time, knowing she'd be staying. The parlor she'd only glimpsed before revealed itself fully. Comfortable furniture worn soft with use, a fireplace with a mantel that held a few photographs and simple frames, windows that let in generous light. The kitchen, where she had already spent time cooking, opened into a dining room with a table large enough for 8. Stairs rose from the entrance hall, polished wood worn smooth at the center of each step from years of feet passing up and down. Upstairs, Colt led her past his closed bedroom door. Past the room he'd mentioned was Sarah's sewing room, past the storage room to a door at the end of the hall that stood slightly ajar. This was going to be for the baby," he said quietly, pushing the door open fully. "After Sarah died, I couldn't bear to do anything with it. It's been empty ever since." The room was flooded with morning light from an east-facing window, just as he'd promised. The walls were painted a soft cream color, and someone Sarah Lillian assumed had stenciled delicate wild flowers along the top edge, a border of blues and yellows and gentle greens. The bed was large and sturdy, made up with quilts that looked handmade. A wardrobe stood against one wall, a washstand with pitcher and basin against another. A small fireplace with a simple mantel would provide warmth in winter. And in the corner, almost hidden, stood a beautifully carved wooden cradle that would never hold the child it was made for. Lillian's throat tightened at the sight of it. "I can move that," Colt said quickly, following her gaze. "Should have done it already. I'll put it in storage." "No." The word came out sharper than she intended, and she softened it immediately. "No, please. It's beautiful. It should stay. It's part of the room's story." Colt looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Lillian set her hand on the cradle's edge, feeling the smooth wood, the care that had gone into its making. "Pretending grief doesn't exist doesn't make it disappear. You taught me that this morning." He nodded slowly, then set her bag on the bed. "All right, then. This is your room now, Lillian, your space. The door locks from the inside if you want privacy. There's linens in the wardrobe, and if you need anything else, just ask." He turned to leave to give her space to settle in, but Lillian found herself speaking before she could think better of it. "Colt," he paused in the doorway, looking back. "Thank you," she said simply, "for all of this, for being kind." His smile was gentle. "You're welcome, Lillian. Take your time getting settled. I'll be in the barn if you need anything." Then he was gone, his footsteps receding down the stairs, and Lillian was alone in a room that felt like possibility made tangible. She sank onto the bed and let herself feel it, the softness of the quilt, the strength of the mattress beneath, the way the light fell through the window in gentle patterns. This could be hers, this room, this house. This life. All she had to do was say yes to a man she barely knew, trust in a future she couldn't predict, and believe that sometimes safety could be found in the most unexpected places. The days that followed established a new rhythm. Lillian woke in her room with the sunrise, dressed, and made her way downstairs to start breakfast for Colt and the men. She found she enjoyed the routine of it, the ritual of making coffee, frying eggs and bacon, setting out fresh biscuits or pancakes, depending on what she'd prepared the night before. The men ate with hearty appreciation, and gradually their initial weariness of her presence faded into acceptance. Then something approaching family. Dutch took to calling her Miss Lily despite her protests, and Tommy would linger after meals to help with dishes, telling her rambling stories about his family back in Kansas and the girl he'd left behind, who maybe possibly, if he saved enough money, might agree to come west and marry him. You should write to her, Lillian advised one morning, as they dried dishes together. Tell her about your life here, about your plans. Give her something concrete to say yes to write proper. Tommy admitted, his ears going red. Never had much schooling. Then I'll help you, Lillian offered. We'll write together and you can tell me what to say. The joy on his face was worth every minute she'd spend helping him craft those letters. Colt, meanwhile, continued his careful courtship, though he never called it that. He'd ask her opinion on ranch matters, showing her the account books and explaining how he managed finances. He'd invite her to ride out with him when weather and work permitted, showing her more of the land and its rhythms. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch after dinner, talking about nothing and everything. Her childhood in St. Louis, his years in Pennsylvania before heading west, the books they'd read, the dreams they'd harbored before life got complicated. They never touched beyond the occasional brush of hands passing a coffee cup, or a steadying grip when she stumbled on uneven ground. Colt maintained that respectful distance he'd promised, and Lillian found herself grateful for it, even as some small growing part of her wondered what it might be like if that distance closed. On her 10th day at the ranch, storm clouds began gathering on the horizon, dark and heavy, with the promise of the first major spring storm. Colt and the men worked frantically to secure everything before it hit, bringing horses in from pasture, checking fence lines, making sure the cattle had access to shelter in the low valleys. Lillian spent the day preparing for the storm in her own way, cooking a large pot of stew that could feed everyone for days if they got snowed in, baking extra bread, making sure the woodpile was stocked and covered. She moved through the house, closing shutters and checking for drafts, driven by an instinct she didn't fully understand to protect this place that was starting to feel like home. As darkness fell, the wind began to howl, and the first fat drops of rain spattered against the windows. Then came the thunder rolling across the prairie like God's own drum, followed by lightning that split the sky in jagged white lines. The storm intensified quickly, rain turning to sleep, temperature dropping so fast that Lillian could feel the cold pressing against the window glass. The men made it to the bunkhouse before the worst hit, but Colt stayed longer, double-checking everything one last time. Lillian watched from the kitchen window, her heart in her throat as he fought his way through wind and driving sleet toward the main house. When he finally burst through the door, he was soaked through, ice crystals forming in his hair and beard. "Lord above," he gasped, shaking like a dog and sending water flying. "That's going to be a bad one." "Get out of those clothes before you freeze," Lillian ordered, already moving toward the stove where she'd kept water heating. "I'll get you dry things and make hot coffee." She didn't think about propriety or the strangeness of ordering him around in his own house. Some instinct deeper than thought had kicked in, the same instinct that had driven her to take care of her mother through her illness, to manage her father's household after her mother's death. The instinct to nurture, to protect, to provide comfort where it was needed. Colt stripped off his wet coat and boots by the door, then disappeared upstairs while Lillian poured coffee and added a generous slug of whiskey from the bottle she'd found in the pantry. When he returned, dressed in dry clothes with his hair roughly toweled, she pressed the mug into his hands. "Drink," she commanded, "all of it." He obeyed with a slight smile, and she watched the color slowly return to his face as warmth seeped back into his body. Outside, the storm raged on, wind shrieking around the corners of the house, sleet hammering at the windows like handfuls of thrown stones. "Cattle?" Lillian asked. Should be fine if they had sense enough to head for the valleys, Colt replied. Can't do anything about it now until the storm passes. Just have to wait and hope. The waiting was hard. They ate dinner in the kitchen, the stew Lillian had made earlier, and though they tried to make conversation, both kept glancing toward the windows, toward the violence happening outside, when the first sound of cattle bellowing in distress reached them, faint beneath the storm's roar. Colt was on his feet instantly. Something's wrong, he said, already moving toward the door. You can't go out in this, Lillian protested, following him. You'll freeze to death before you find them. If they broke through the fence near the gulch, they could fall and break their necks or get trapped in a drift. I have to check. He was pulling on his still damp coat, his expression set in lines of grim determination. Lillian didn't think. She ran upstairs, grabbed her warmest shawl, threw it over her own coat, and was back downstairs before Colt had finished lacing his boots. What are you doing? He demanded. Coming with you, she said flatly. You're not going out there alone. Like hell you are. Would you waste time arguing, or should we go before it gets worse? Lillian moved past him to the door, her hands already reaching for the latch. For a moment she thought he'd physically stop her, but then something shifted in his expression. Recognition maybe, or respect for the steel in her spine that matched his own stubbornness. Stay close to me, he said gruffly. Do exactly what I say when I say it. If I tell you to run back to the house, you run. Understood? Understood. They plunged into the storm together, and the world disappeared into a chaos of wind and cold and darkness, broken only by occasional flashes of lightning that showed the landscape in stark, terrifying relief. Colt grabbed her hand, his grip iron strong, pulling her toward the barn, where they saddled horses with numb fingers. Then they were riding, hunched against the wind, following the sound of distressed cattle toward the northern boundary, where the land dropped away into a rocky gulch. The ride was a nightmare. Wind tried to tear them from their saddles, ice formed on the horse manes and their own faces. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and twice Lillian's horse stumbled, making her heart lurch sickeningly. But Colt's hand stayed locked on her res, keeping her close, keeping her steady, his voice occasionally cutting through the storm with directions. This way, watch the rocks. Stay with me. They found the cattle, about 15 head, milling in panic near a section of fence that had been blown down, the gap leading directly to a steep drop into the gulch. 3 were already missing, their bellows echoing up from below. The rest were pressed against each other, eyes rolling white with fear, seconds away from stampeding over the edge in their panic. We have to turn them to turn, Colt shouted over in the wind. Drive them back toward the valley, away from the gulch. What followed was the longest hour of Lillian's life. She and Colt worked in desperate tandem, their horses wheeling and turning, driving the panicked cattle away from danger, inch by hard 1 inch. Lightning flashed, thunder boomed, and the wind tried to push everything, cattle, horses, humans, toward the deadly drop. Lillian's world narrowed to Colt's voice guiding her, to the warmth of the horse beneath her, to the absolute necessity of staying in the saddle and keeping the cattle moving in the right direction. She didn't see the patch of ice. One moment her horse was sure-footed beneath her. The next, its legs were sliding out, going down hard. Lillian flew from the saddle, landing in a snowdrift that knocked the wind from her lungs. Her horse scrambled up and shied away. Frightened, she tried to stand to call after it, but her legs wouldn't work properly, wouldn't bear her weight. Then Colt was there, somehow there, despite the chaos and the cattle and the storm, vaulting from his own horse, and half running, half sliding to where she'd fallen. His arms came around her, lifting her from the snow, his face above hers tight with fear she'd never seen there before. Are you hurt? He shouted, hands moving over her carefully, checking for breaks, for blood. Lillian, are you hurt? Just bruised, she gasped, though she wasn't entirely sure. Everything hurt, and she was so cold she couldn't feel her feet. The cattle. Damn the cattle, Colt swore fierce and low. They're not worth your life. But even as he said it, they could hear the panicked lowing, moving in the right direction, away from the gulch, toward safety. They'd done it somehow. The cattle were safe. Getting back to the ranch was a blur. Colt lifted her onto his horse, mounted behind her, and held her against his chest as they rode. She could feel the solid strength of him, the heat of his body cutting through the cold, the way his arms formed a barrier between her and the worst of the wind. Her horse followed behind, spooked but obedient. By the time they reached the barn, Lillian was shaking uncontrollably, her teeth chattering so hard she couldn't form words. Colt swung down, pulled her into his arms, and carried her not to the barn, but directly to the main house. He kicked the door open, barely paused to strip their wet outer layers, then carried her straight upstairs to her room, where he deposited her on the bed, and immediately began building a fire in the fireplace. "Get out of those wet clothes," he ordered without looking at her, focused entirely on coaxing flames from kindling. "All of them. There should be dry nightgowns in the wardrobe and extra quilts in the chest at the foot of the bed." Lillian's fingers fumbled with buttons and laces, numb and clumsy. She managed to shrug out of her dress, but couldn't manage the fastenings on her corset. "I can't," she started, frustrated and frightened by how weak she suddenly felt. Colt turned, took one look at her, struggling, and crossed to her without hesitation. "Turn around," he said quietly. And when she did, his fingers, cold but steady, worked the laces free with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. For Sarah, probably in another life. He helped her out of it, kept his eyes carefully averted, then handed her a nightgown and turned his back while she changed with shaking hands. "Done," she managed through chattering teeth. He turned back, quickly assessed her, then began piling quilts on top of her. 3, 4, 5 of them, layers of weight and warmth that slowly began to ease the terrible cold that had settled into her bones. He sat beside her on the edge of the bed, still fully dressed himself, despite being just as soaked. "You should change too," Lillian protested. "You'll get sick." "I'll change when I'm sure you're all right," Colt said firmly. He rubbed her hands between his own, trying to restore circulation, his face still tight with worry. "What you did tonight was brave and foolish in equal measure. You could have died, Lillian." "So could you," she pointed out, finding her voice getting stronger as warmth slowly returned. "I wasn't going to let you go out there alone." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise maybe, or recognition, or something deeper that she couldn't quite name. "Why?" he asked softly. "Why would you risk yourself for my cattle, for my ranch?" Lillian met his gaze steadily, and in that moment something shifted between them, something fundamental and irrevocable. "Because it's not just your ranch anymore," she said quietly. "Because you gave me shelter when I had nowhere else to go. Because you've treated me with more kindness and respect in 10 days than Marcus showed me in 2 years. Because," she stopped, swallowed, gathered her courage. "Because you matter to me, Colt Mercer, and I wasn't going to let you face that storm alone." The silence that fell between them was different from any silence before, charged, significant. Outside, the storm still raged, but inside this room, with firelight dancing across the walls and quilts piled high, and Lillian's words hanging in the air between them, it felt like the calm at the center of everything. Colt's hand came up slowly, carefully, and brushed a strand of damp hair from her face. His touch was gentle, reverent, like he was handling something precious and breakable. "You're safe, Lil," he whispered, using the shortened version of her name for the first time, making it an endearment. "You're safe now. I've got you." And for the first time since fleeing St. Louis, maybe for the first time in her whole life, Lillian believed it. Colt stayed with her through the night, sitting in the chair he'd pulled close to the bed, feeding the fire every time it threatened to die down. Lillian drifted in and out of sleep, each time waking to find him there, a solid, reassuring presence in the firelit darkness. Once she woke to find him slumped forward, finally succumbing to exhaustion, and she watched the rise and fall of his shoulders as he breathed. This man who'd carried her through a blizzard and refused to leave her side, even when his own body was crying out for rest. Dawn broke grey and cold, the storm finally spent, but leaving behind a world transformed by ice and snow. Lillian woke fully to find Colt gone, the fire freshly stoked, and a note on the bedside table in rough but legible handwriting. "Gone to check the herd. Dutch will bring breakfast. Rest today. That's an order. See?" She smiled despite the aches in her body, touched by his concern, even as she bristled slightly at being ordered to rest. She'd never been good at sitting idle. But when she tried to stand, her legs trembled, and her bruised ribs protested sharply enough to make her catch her breath. Maybe rest wasn't such a bad idea after all. True to Colt's word, Dutch appeared within the hour, carrying a tray laden with eggs, bacon, toast, and strong coffee. He set it on her lap with surprising gentleness for such a gruff man, then stood there, shifting his weight from foot to foot, clearly wanting to say something, but unsure how to begin. "Spit it out, Dutch," Lillian said, taking a grateful sip of coffee. "I can see you've got words stuck in your throat." He barked a laugh. "Boss told us what you did last night, riding out into that storm, helping save the herd. That took guts, Miss Lily. Real guts." He paused, his weathered face serious. "But it also took something else. It took caring. A hired hand might have let the boss go alone. It's his cattle, his risk. But you wrote out because you cared what happened to him. That tells me everything I need to know about you." Lillian felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I just did what anyone would do." "No, Mom, you didn't. You did what family does." Dutch settled his hat more firmly on his head. "I've been with Colt Mercer for 6 years now. Watched him build this place from nothing. Watched him love Sarah. Watched him nearly die of grief when he lost her. Last night was the first time since then I've seen real fear in his eyes. Fear for someone else. Fear of losing something precious. You brought that back to him, Miss Lily. You brought him back to life." Before she could respond, he was gone, closing the door softly behind him and leaving her alone with her breakfast and thoughts that tumbled over themselves like calves learning to run. She spent the day as ordered, resting and recovering, though her mind was far from quiet. Every sound made her look toward the door, hoping it was Colt returning, but he stayed out with the men, assessing storm damage and searching for the cattle that had gone over the gulch. When evening came and he still hadn't appeared, Lillian finally gave in to worry and made her way downstairs, wrapped in her mother's shawl against the cold that seeped through the house. She found evidence of his return, muddy boots by the door, his heavy coat hung to dry, but no sign of the man himself. Then she heard it, the sound of an axe biting into wood, rhythmic and relentless, coming from behind the house. She wrapped the shawl tighter and ventured out into the bitter cold. Colt was at the woodpile, stripped down to his shirt despite the freezing temperature, swinging the axe with fury that spoke of demons being exorcised with each blow. Split logs flew in all directions, and the pile of firewood grew steadily, far more than they could possibly need. This wasn't about preparation. This was about working something out of his system, something dark and fierce that needed physical release. Lillian watched for a moment, then stepped forward. "Colt." The axe froze mid-swing. He turned and she saw the tracks on his face that weren't entirely from sweat. His eyes were red-rimmed, haunted, holding a pain so raw it made her chest ache. "You should be resting," he said, his voice rough. "So should you." She moved closer, heedless of the cold. "What happened out there?" He drove the axe into the chopping block and turned away, his shoulders rigid. "Lost 3 head. Found them at the bottom of the gulch, necks broken. Quick deaths, at least." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked. "If you'd gone over that edge last night when your horse fell, if I'd lost you the same way." "But you didn't." Lillian closed the distance between them, placing her hand on his back, feeling the tension coiled there like a spring wound too tight. "I'm here. I'm fine. A few bruises, nothing more. You don't understand." He turned to face her, and the anguish in his expression stopped her breath. "When I saw you go down, when I couldn't reach you fast enough, for just a moment, I was back there 5 years ago holding Sarah while she slipped away, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do to stop it. I can't." His voice broke completely. "I can't go through that again, Lillian. I can't watch someone I care about slip away." The admission hung between them, raw and honest, and terrifying in its vulnerability. "Someone I care about." The words echoed in her head, in her heart, settling into places she hadn't known were empty. "Then don't," she said softly, stepping closer, still until only inches separated them. "Don't watch me slip away. Watch me stay. Watch me stand right here, alive and whole, and choosing to be exactly where I am." His hands came up to cup her face, rough palms against her cheeks, thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. You're choosing this. Choosing me, this life, all the risks that come with it. I'm choosing you, Lillian confirmed, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. If the offer still stands, if you still want a wife instead of a servant, then my answer is yes, Colt Mercer. Yes, I'll marry you. The kiss, when it came, was nothing like she'd feared and everything she hadn't known to hope for. Gentle at first, almost reverent, like he was afraid she might shatter. But when she pressed closer, her hands fisting in his shirt, something shifted. The kiss deepened, became a conversation without words. Grief and hope and fear and courage all tangled together. Two people who'd survived separate hells, finding unexpected sanctuary in each other. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Colt pressed his forehead to hers. I'll keep you safe, he promised. Whatever it takes, whatever comes. I'll keep you safe. And I'll stand beside you, Lillian answered. Through storms and losses and whatever else life throws at us, that's what partners do. The word partners made him smile, and she felt the last of the tension drain from his body. He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers with a naturalness that suggested they'd been doing this for years rather than minutes. Come on, he said gently. You're freezing, and I need to get cleaned up. Let's go inside before we both turn into icicles. They walked back to the house, hand in hand, and something fundamental had shifted between them. The careful distance Colt had maintained, the walls Lillian had kept erected around her heart, all of it had crumbled in the space of a kiss and a promise. This was real now. This was happening. That evening they sat together in the parlor, a fire crackling in the hearth, discussing practicalities with the same straightforward honesty that had characterized everything between them from the start. We should marry soon, Colt said, his arm around her shoulders as they shared the settee. Not because I'm trying to rush you, but because it'll offer you legal protection. If Marcus Webb does come looking, a marriage certificate and a husband willing to stand up for you will carry weight with the law. Lillian nodded, the mention of Marcus sending a familiar spike of fear through her chest, but smaller now, more manageable, with Colt's solid presence beside her. How soon? Circuit Judge comes through Copper Springs once a month. He'll be here in 2 weeks. Colt looked at her carefully. That give you enough time? I know it's fast, but 2 weeks is fine, Lillian interrupted. More than fine. I don't need a fancy wedding, Colt. I just need it to be real. It'll be real, he assured her. Real as anything I've ever done. He was quiet for a moment, then added, Lillian, I want you to know my proposal earlier about separate rooms, about taking things slow. That still stands. Ring on your finger doesn't change the fact that you set the pace for everything else. When you're ready, if you're ready, we move forward, not before. The consideration in his words, the respect for her autonomy even now made her love him a little bit more. And yes, she recognized it for what it was. Love. Maybe not the passionate, consuming fire of storybooks, but something steadier, deeper. The love of someone who'd seen her at her most desperate and vulnerable and chosen her anyway. The love of someone who put her well-being ahead of his own desires. Thank you, she said quietly, for understanding, for not expecting Lillian. He turned to face her fully, his dark eyes serious. What Marcus did or tried to do, that wasn't about love or desire. That was about power and control. I never want you to feel that way with me ever. This marriage is about partnership, about building something together. The physical side of it, if and when it happens, should be about joy, not obligation, about both of us choosing it freely. Tears pricked at her eyes again, but these were different. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of finally feeling truly seen and valued. How did you get to be so wise? Years of making mistakes and learning from them, Colt said with a slight smile. Sarah taught me a lot about listening, about putting someone else's needs equal to your own. I didn't always get it right with her, but I'm trying to honor what she taught me by getting it right with you. The mention of Sarah, which might have felt threatening or awkward, instead felt natural. His first wife was part of his history, part of what made him the man he was. Lillian found she could accept that, could even be grateful to the woman who'd loved him first for helping shape him into someone capable of such consideration. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of preparation. Word of the impending wedding spread through the ranch and into town, bringing unexpected support. The Sullivan brothers' mother sent fabric for a new dress, pale blue cotton with tiny white flowers. Tommy's sweetheart's sister, who worked as a seamstress, sent detailed instructions for cutting and sewing it properly. Even Dutch contributed, producing from somewhere a battered but serviceable pair of women's boots that had belonged to his late wife. She'd want them to go to someone who'd used them proper, he said gruffly when Lillian tried to thank him. She always said good boots were more important than a fancy dress. Anyway, Lillian worked on the dress in the evenings, her stitches neat and careful, while Colt sat across from her working on ranch accounts or reading. The domestic intimacy of it felt strange at first. She kept waiting for him to demand something, to expect something, but gradually she relaxed into it. This was companionship, pure and simple. Two people sharing space and comfortable silence, occasionally exchanging comments or observations, building the foundation of a life together, one quiet evening at a time. She wrote a letter to her father after much deliberation, not telling him where she was that felt too dangerous with Marcus in the picture, but letting him know she was safe, that she'd found work and would be marrying soon. She kept it vague, gave no return address, and mailed it from Copper Springs when she and Colt went to town for supplies. It was a small gesture, but it mattered. Whatever else had happened, her father had loved her mother and had tried in his weak way to love her too. He deserved to know she'd survived. The trip to town was Lillian's first real venture beyond the ranch boundaries, and she viewed Copper Springs with the curious eyes of someone seeing frontier civilization for the first time. It was smaller than she'd expected, one main street with a general store, a bank, a saloon, a small church, and scattered houses, but it buzzed with life and purpose. People moved with the efficient energy of those who had much to do and limited daylight to do it in. Colt introduced her around with unmistakable pride. "This is Lillian Hayes, my fiancée. We'll be married when Judge Morrison comes through next week." The words flowed easily, and people responded with genuine warmth. The storekeeper's wife immediately began making suggestions for household items Lillian might need. The banker, a portly man named Henderson, shook her hand and welcomed her to the community. Even the saloon keeper, a woman named Kate, with shrewd eyes and a kind smile, offered congratulations and an invitation to tea. "Don't let the saloon fool you," Kate said with a wink. "I'm perfectly respectable when I want to be, and new women in this territory are scarcer than rain in July. We've got to stick together." It was the first time since leaving St. Louis that Lillian felt part of a community, part of something larger than her own survival. These people didn't care about her past or judge her for arriving at Colt's ranch with nothing but the clothes on her back. They cared that she was willing to work hard, that she treated people with respect, and that she was marrying one of their own. It was enough. On the ride back to the ranch, supplies loaded in the wagon bed, Lillian found herself smiling for no particular reason. "Happy?" Colt asked, noticing. "Yes," she realized with some surprise. "I think I actually am." "Good." He reached over and squeezed her hand. "That's all I want, Lillian, for you to be happy here, to feel like you belong. Everything else is just details. But the details matter too." Back at the ranch, she finished her dress and tried it on in her room, studying herself in the small mirror above the washstand. The woman looking back was different from the desperate, terrified creature who'd stumbled up to the gate 3 weeks ago. This woman had color in her cheeks, clarity in her eyes, and something that might have been hope in the set of her shoulders. The night before the wedding, Lillian couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, listening to the house settle around her, thinking about tomorrow, about the vows she'd make and the life she was choosing. Fear still lingered. Fear that Marcus would somehow find her. That this happiness was too fragile to last, that she'd wake up and discover it had all been a desperate dream, born of exhaustion and want. A soft knock at her door made her sit up. "Lillian, you awake?" Colt's voice quiet and concerned. She rose, wrapped her mother's shawl around her nightgown, and opened the door. He stood there in the hallway, fully dressed despite the late hour, lamp in hand, looking uncertain in a way she'd never seen him. "Couldn't sleep either," he admitted. "Kept thinking about tomorrow, about whether I'm doing right by you, whether this is really what you want, or if you just feel you have no other choice." "Come in," Lillian said, stepping back. When he hesitated, she added, "Please, we should talk." He entered, set the lamp on her table, and stood awkwardly as if unsure whether sitting on her bed would be presumptuous. Lillian settled on the edge of it and patted the space beside her, and after a moment he sat, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Colt Mercer," she said, turning to face him, "I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. When I came to your gate, I was desperate. I would have taken any work, any shelter, just to survive one more day. But what I found here, what you offered me, was so much more than survival. You offered me respect, safety, partnership, the chance to build something real instead of just running from something terrible." She took his hand, holding it between both of hers. "Tomorrow, when I stand before that judge and promise to be your wife, it won't be because I have no other choice. It'll be because I'm choosing you. This life, this ranch, this future we're building together. Do you understand? I'm choosing this." The relief that washed over his face was profound. "I needed to hear that," he admitted. "I needed to know I wasn't forcing you into something you'd regret. The only thing I'd regret is not having the courage to say yes." Lillian smiled. "Now, about tomorrow. I know we're keeping it simple, but I need you to know something. I don't care about a fancy ceremony or a big celebration. All I care about is that when it's done, I'll be your wife in truth. That means something to me, Colt. More than I knew it would." He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with old-fashioned courtliness. "It means something to me, too. More than I thought possible after Sarah. I thought that part of my life was done, that I'd spend the rest of my days alone. But you," he trailed off, searching for words, "you made me remember what it feels like to want a future instead of just enduring the present." They sat together in the lamplight, hands clasped, until the fear and doubt had been talked away and only anticipation remained. When Colt finally rose to leave, he paused at the door. "Sleep well, Lillian Hayes," he said softly. "Tomorrow you'll be Lillian Mercer, and we'll start building our life in earnest." "I can't wait," she whispered back, and meant it with her whole heart. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, spring finally asserting itself over winter's lingering grip. Lillian dressed with trembling hands, the blue dress fitting perfectly, thanks to her careful stitching. She pinned her hair up in a simple style, letting a few curls frame her face, and wished desperately that her mother could be there to see her. But the shawl wrapped around her shoulders carried her mother's memory, and that would have to be enough. Dutch drove them to town in the wagon, freshly scrubbed and wearing what Lillian suspected was his only good shirt. Tommy and the Sullivan brothers came along, equally cleaned up and clearly excited for the occasion. Colt rode beside the wagon on his bay Geeling, and Lillian couldn't help but notice how handsome he looked in his dark suit, his hair trimmed and his beard neatly groomed. The ceremony took place in the small church with Judge Morrison presiding and half the town in attendance, despite the short notice. Kate from the saloon sat in the front row beaming. The storekeeper and his wife stood as witnesses. Even the banker had shown up, looking pleased at the prospect of a new family joining the community. Judge Morrison was a stern-looking man with kind eyes who spoke the traditional words with gravity and warmth. When he got to the vows, Lillian found her voice was steady, clear, ringing through the small church with conviction. "I, Lillian Hayes, take you, Colt Mercer, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to stand beside you in good times and bad, in sickness and health, through storms and sunshine. I promise to be your partner, your friend, your support, from this day forward, for as long as we both shall live." Colt's voice, when he repeated the vows, was deep and sure, his eyes never leaving hers. "I, Colt Mercer, take you, Lillian Hayes, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to protect you, to honor you, to value you as my equal and my partner. I promise to give you space to be yourself, to grow, to find joy. I promise to build a life with you, not just for you. From this day forward, for as long as we both shall live." The ring he slipped on her finger was simple gold, warm from his pocket, and it settled into place like it had always belonged there. When Judge Morrison pronounced them husband and wife and told Colt he could kiss his bride, the kiss was sweet and brief and full of promise. The celebration afterward was held in the church hall with food brought by half the town and music provided by a fiddler who appeared from somewhere. Lillian found herself swept up in congratulations and introductions, meeting wives and daughters and mothers who welcomed her with open arms. These frontier women understood what it meant to start over, to build a life from nothing, to find strength in unexpected places. Kate pulled her aside at one point, pressing a small package into her hands. "For your wedding night," she said with a knowing smile. "Just some lavender sachets and nice soap. Nothing scandalous, so don't look so worried. But every bride deserves something pretty, even if she married in practical fashion." "Thank you," Lillian said, touched by the gesture. "For everything, for making me feel welcome." "That's what we do here," Kate replied simply. "We take care of our own, and you're one of us now, Mrs. Mercer. Don't forget it." Mrs. Mercer, the name settled over her like a coat that fit perfectly. Protection and identity and belonging, all wrapped into two simple words. As evening approached and they prepared to head back to the ranch, Colt found her talking with the minister's wife and gently touched her elbow. "Ready to go home?" he asked, and the word home made her heart flutter. "Yes," she said, taking his offered arm. "Let's go home." The ride back was quieter, everyone pleasantly exhausted from celebration. The sun was setting by the time they reached the ranch, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that seemed like nature's own benediction on the day. Dutch and the others headed to the bunkhouse with cheerful good nights, leaving Colt and Lillian alone in the yard. For a moment they just stood there, suddenly uncertain. They were married now, legally bound, and the house waited for them. Their house, their home, their future. The weight of it felt enormous and terrifying and wonderful all at once. "Lillian," Colt said quietly, "I meant what I said before. Nothing has to change tonight unless you want it to. You're my wife now, and that means everything. But it doesn't have to mean anything you're not ready for." She looked at him in the fading light. This good man who'd given her everything without asking for anything in return, who'd respected her boundaries even as he offered her his name and protection and partnership. And she realized that somewhere along the way, fear had transformed into trust, and gratitude had blossomed into something deeper. "I know," she said softly, "and I love you for that consideration. But Colt," she took a deep breath, gathering her courage, "I'm not Sarah. I can't replace her, and I'm not trying to, but I am your wife now in truth. And I'd like to start this marriage as we mean to go on together, truly together." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by something that might have been awe. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." She reached up to touch his face, feeling the roughness of his beard, the warmth of his skin. "I've never been more sure of anything. You've given me time to heal, space to choose, and I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you, choosing us." He swept her into his arms, then carrying her up the porch steps and through the door in a tradition as old as marriage itself. Inside, he sat her down gently, his hands framing her face, his kiss tender and searching and full of questions. She answered with the way she pressed closer, her arms wrapping around his neck. "I'll be gentle," he promised against her lips. "I'll go slow. You tell me if you need to stop." Colt, she pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "I trust you completely. Now stop talking and kiss your wife." His laugh was low and warm and full of joy. And when he kissed her again, it was different, deeper, more certain. An invitation and a promise all at once. He led her upstairs to his room, their room now, where lamplight cast everything in warm gold, and the bed looked impossibly inviting. What followed was nothing like Lillian's fears, nothing like the rough grasping of Marcus's attempted assaults. Colt touched her like she was precious, kissed her like she was beloved, moved with her like they were learning a new language together, halting at first, then gradually finding their rhythm. When she tensed, he slowed. When she sighed, he smiled. And when she finally gave herself over completely to the moment, to him, to the overwhelming rightness of being with someone who valued her pleasure as much as his own, she understood what it meant to be truly married. Afterward, wrapped in his arms with her head on his chest and his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, Lillian felt something inside her finally settle. For the first time since her mother's death, maybe for the first time in her entire life, she felt completely, absolutely safe. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. For what? Colt's hand traced lazy patterns on her back. For being patient, for waiting, for making this. She gestured vaguely at the two of them tangled together in the lamplight. For making this about us, instead of just about need or obligation. He kissed the top of her head. Thank you for trusting me, for giving me a second chance at this, at marriage, at partnership, at love. I know I said earlier this was about practicality and mutual benefit, but Lillian, he paused, choosing his words carefully. I've fallen in love with you. Somewhere between you showing up at my gate and you riding into a blizzard to save my cattle, and you standing in that church today, promising to be my wife, I fell completely, irrevocably in love with you. Tears pricked at her eyes, but these were happy tears, tears of relief and joy and overwhelming gratitude. I love you too, she confessed. I didn't think I could. I thought Marcus had broken something in me that couldn't be fixed, but you showed me that wasn't true. You showed me what real love looks like, what real partnership means, and I love you for it. I love you for all of it. They lay together talking until the lamp burned low and exhaustion finally claimed them, falling asleep, wrapped around each other like they'd been doing it for years instead of hours. Outside, the Wyoming night settled over the ranch, stars wheeling overhead in their ancient dance. Spring was taking hold, winter's grip finally broken, and tomorrow would bring new work, new challenges, new joys to discover. But for tonight, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Two people who'd survived their own separate hells had found unexpected heaven in each other's arms. Two souls who'd been broken had discovered they fit together in ways that made them both stronger. Lillian Mercer, and yes, she was Lillian Mercer now, truly and completely, fell asleep with a smile on her face and hope blooming warm and sure in her chest. The future stretched ahead, unknown and full of possibility. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't afraid of it. She was ready. The first weeks of their marriage unfolded with a sweetness that surprised them both. Lillian woke each morning to find Colt already up, though he always left coffee warming on the stove and often a wildflower on her pillow. Small gestures that spoke louder than grand declarations. She'd dress and come downstairs to find him at the kitchen table going over accounts or repairing tack, and he'd look up with a smile that made her heart skip even as it settled deeper into certainty. They fell into rhythms that felt both new and ancient, as if they'd been doing this dance for decades instead of days. Breakfast together before the men arrived, stolen moments throughout the day when their paths crossed, his hand on her waist as he passed through the kitchen, her fingers brushing his shoulder when she brought him water in the barn. Evenings on the porch watching the sunset, talking about everything and nothing, building a foundation of shared understanding, one conversation at a time. At night, they came together with increasing confidence and deepening connection, learning what brought pleasure, what sparked laughter, what made the other sigh with contentment. Colt was endlessly patient, attentive to her responses, and Lillian discovered that her body, which she'd thought Marcus had somehow tainted or broken, was capable of joy she'd never imagined. More than that, she discovered she could take joy in bringing pleasure to someone she loved. That intimacy could be reciprocal and generous, rather than one-sided and demanding. You're thinking too hard, Colt murmured one night, feeling the tension in her shoulders as they lay together afterward. I can practically hear your mind working. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, Lillian said quickly, then reconsidered. They'd promised honesty with each other, even when it was difficult. Sometimes I can't quite believe this is real, that I'm allowed to be this happy, like I'm waiting for something to go wrong. Colt propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her in the moonlight that streamed through their window. Things will go wrong, Lil. That's life. Storms and droughts and cattle getting sick and crops failing. But we'll face those things together, and we'll survive them because we're partners. That's what makes this different from what you had before. You're not facing the world alone anymore. Neither are you, she pointed out, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw. You carried Sarah's loss alone for 5 years. But you don't have to carry anything alone now either. His kiss was answer enough, deep and sweet and full of promise. The ranch thrived under their joint management. Lillian discovered she had a head for numbers and took over the account books. finding small ways to economize that added up to significant savings. She also proved surprisingly adept at dealing with cattle buyers who came through her St. Louis upbringing, giving her a polish that impressed men used to negotiating only with rough cowboys. More than one buyer remarked to Colt that he'd married well, and the pride in his eyes when he looked at her made her stand a little straighter. She transformed the house into a true home, not through grand gestures, but through accumulated small touches: curtains sewn from fabric scraps, wild flowers on the kitchen table, the smell of bread baking and stew simmering. The men began finding excuses to linger near the house at meal times, drawn by good food and the warmth of Lillian's welcome. Even Dutch, who'd lived rough for decades and claimed to prefer solitude, could be found on the porch most evenings, smoking his pipe and telling stories while Lillian listened and Colt whittled. Tommy's letters to his sweetheart continued with Lillian's help, and by late spring he received word that she'd accepted his proposal and would be coming west in the fall. His joy was infectious, and Lillian found herself making plans to help him prepare, teaching him better hygiene habits, helping him save his wages for a ring, even starting to set aside fabric to help make curtains for whatever cabin he'd build. "You're mothering him," Colt observed one evening, amusement coloring his tone. "Someone needs to," Lillian retorted, but without heat. "The boy's 19 and doesn't know how to do his own laundry properly. His bride will thank me for civilizing him at least a little." "Your bride thanks you for civilizing me too," Colt said, pulling her onto his lap despite her laughing protests. "I was a complete barbarian before you arrived, eating beans from cans, sleeping in my clothes." "You were not," Lillian interrupted, swatting his shoulder. "You were perfectly capable of taking care of yourself. You just needed someone to take care of you instead now and then." His expression softened, losing its teasing edge. "I did. I do. And you're remarkably good at it, at knowing when I need space and when I need company, when to push and when to just sit with me in silence." "That goes both ways," Lillian said quietly, settling against his chest. "You do the same for me." It was true. Colt had learned to read her moods with uncanny accuracy. On days when old fears crept in and she found herself jumping at sudden noises or scanning the horizon for threats that weren't there, he'd find reasons to keep her close, asking her opinion on things that didn't really require it, inviting her to ride out with him, simply being present without demanding explanations. On days when she needed to feel useful and productive, he'd step back and let her take charge, praising her contributions without making her feel like she had to earn her place. By the time summer settled over the prairie in earnest, Lillian felt she'd lived at the ranch for years rather than months. The rhythms of it had become second nature. The early mornings, the hard work, the simple pleasures of meals shared, and evenings spent watching storms roll across distant horizons. She'd learned to ride properly under Colt's patient instruction, and now she could handle Daisy with confidence, even helping with roundup when extra hands were needed. She'd also become part of the small community of ranch wives in the area. Kate from Copper Springs visited regularly, bringing gossip and supplies and an irreverent humor that Lillian found refreshing. The minister's wife, Ellen Morrison, proved to be warm and intelligent beneath her quiet demeanor, and she and Lillian spent hours discussing books and philosophy while their hands stayed busy with sewing or preserving. Even Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, who'd initially seemed cool and judgmental, thought over time, eventually admitting that she'd been worried Lillian was a gold digger taking advantage of Colt's loneliness. "But I can see it's real between you," Mrs. Henderson said one afternoon during a quilting circle at the church. "The way you look at each other, that's not something that can be faked. My Henry and I, we had an arranged marriage. Took us 5 years to find what you and Colt seem to have found in 5 months." Lillian accepted the compliment with grace, though internally she marveled at it. 5 months. It felt simultaneously like forever in no time at all. Sometimes she caught glimpses of her reflection in windows or mirrors and barely recognized herself. This sun-bred woman with calloused hands and laugh lines beginning at the corners of her eyes. She looked healthy, happy, whole. But happiness, she was learning, didn't mean the absence of fear. It just meant having the strength to face it. The letter arrived on a scorching July afternoon, delivered by a ranch hand from a neighboring property who'd picked up mail in town. Lillian was in the kitchen preserving berries when Colt came in. his expression carefully neutral in a way that immediately set off alarm bells. "Letter for you," he said, holding out an envelope, "postmarked from St. Louis." Lillian's hands, stained purple from berries, trembled as she wiped them on her apron. She knew that handwriting. She'd seen it on household accounts for 2 years, had learned to dread seeing it on notes left for her with instructions or criticisms or barely veiled threats. Marcus Webb had found her. "Do you want me to read it?" Colt asked quietly, staying close but not touching, giving her space to decide. Lillian shook her head, forcing her hand steady as she broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet. The words swam before her eyes at first, but gradually resolved into Marcus's cramped, precise script. "Lillian," it began without endearment or preamble. "Your father is dead. Died 2 weeks ago of a fever that took him quick. Would have been Christian of you to be here for his passing, but you chose to run instead of face your responsibilities. The house and its contents are being sold to settle his debts. Debts you helped create with your wasteful ways. I expect you to return immediately to help settle his affairs and face the consequences of your desertion. I've hired an investigator who will find you eventually. Better to come willingly than be dragged back in shame. Your stepfather, Marcus Webb." The room tilted. Lillian's knees buckled, and she would have fallen if Colt hadn't moved fast, catching her and guiding her to a chair. Her father dead. She'd never see him again, never have a chance to explain or reconcile or tell him she forgave his weakness. The grief hit like a physical blow, stealing her breath. But beneath the grief, rage burned hot and fierce. Marcus had waited 2 weeks to tell her. 2 weeks during which she could have returned for the funeral, could have said goodbye, could have been there. And his threats, his investigator, his demands that she return, his blame for debts that were certainly his own, were calculated to instill maximum fear and guilt. "Let me see," Colt said gently, and Lillian handed him the letter with shaking hands. She watched his jaw tighten as he read, watched his eyes go hard and flat in a way she'd never seen before. "He's lying," Colt said flatly, "about the debts, about you being wasteful, Sullivan. He's trying to manipulate you into coming back." "My father really is dead, though," Lillian whispered, tears finally spilling over. "That part's true. I can feel it. He's gone, and I never got to say goodbye." Colt pulled her into his arms, holding her while she wept for the complicated man who'd been her father. Weak and worn down by grief, unable to protect her when she needed him most. But once upon a time, loving and kind, she cried for lost chances and broken relationships and the finality of death. She cried until she was empty, until the tears stopped and only exhaustion remained. "I'm sorry," Colt murmured into her hair. "I'm so damn sorry, Lil. You deserve better. Better from your father, better from Marcus, better from all of it." "What do I do?" she asked, pulling back to look at him. "Do I go back? Do I try to?" "No." The word was absolute, allowing no argument. "You don't go anywhere near St. Louis or Marcus Webb. Whatever needs to be settled can be handled through lawyers. I'll write to a firm I know in Missouri, have them investigate your father's estate, and deal with Marcus legally. You're not going back there, Lillian. Not now, not ever. But if he's hired an investigator, if he finds out where I am, then he finds out you're the legal wife of Colt Mercer, living on a prosperous ranch in Wyoming territory, with a husband who's very good with a rifle and even better with territorial law." Colt's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "You're not some powerless girl anymore, Lil. You're a married woman with legal protections and a husband who will defend you to his last breath. Marcus Webb holds no power over you now." The certainty in his voice steadied her, pushed back the panic that had been rising like floodwater. He was right. She wasn't the same frightened woman who'd fled in the night. She'd built a life here, established herself, married a man who saw her as an equal partner. Marcus could threaten all he wanted. He couldn't touch her anymore. "I need to write back," Lillian said, wiping her eyes. "Not to Marcus, to hell with Marcus. But to someone insane, Lewis, who can tell me the truth about my father's death. About the estate, Mrs. Patterson, our neighbor. She was kind to me. She'd tell me honestly what happened." "We'll write together," Colt agreed. "And I'll send a telegram to that law firm tomorrow. If there's anything of your father's estate that should rightfully be yours, we'll make sure you get it. Marcus Webb doesn't get to steal from you on top of everything else he's done." That evening they sat at the kitchen table composing letters by lamplight. One to Mrs. Patterson asking for details about her father's death and the disposition of his estate. Another to a law firm in Kansas City that Colt had dealt with before, explaining the situation and asking them to investigate. Colt's letter to the lawyers was blunt and detailed, laying out Marcus's behavior, Lillian's flight, and their subsequent marriage. He requested that they ascertain whether Marcus had any legal claim to contact Lillian, and if not, to send him a letter making it clear that further harassment would result in legal consequences. "Will that work?" Lillian asked, reading over his shoulder. "Will lawyers really be able to stop him?" "Maybe, maybe not," Colt admitted, "but it'll put him on notice that you're not alone and unprotected. Men like Marcus are bullies, and bullies tend to back down when they realize their target has teeth." Over the next few weeks, Lillian alternated between grief and anxiety, mourning her father while dreading what news might come from St. Louis. Colt stayed close without smothering, understanding that she needed both support and space to process. The ranch work continued. Life on the frontier didn't pause for personal tragedy, and Lillian found solace in the familiar rhythms of cooking and preserving and caring for the household. The response from Mrs. Patterson arrived first, and it confirmed Lillian's worst fears, while also offering unexpected comfort. Her father had indeed died of a fever quickly and without much suffering. Mrs. Patterson had been at his bedside and reported that his last words had been of Lillian, expressing regret that he'd failed to protect her and hoped that she'd found safety somewhere. Marcus had claimed Lillian had run off with an unsuitable man and refused to come home even when her father was dying. But Mrs. Patterson hadn't believed it. "Your father's estate was heavily mortgaged," Mrs. Patterson wrote in her careful hand. "But I suspect those debts were Marcus's doing, not your father's. Marcus had your father sign papers near the end. I saw them, but your father was too weak to read them properly. I fear he may have signed away more than he knew. The house was sold at auction last week. Marcus left town the day after, claiming he was going west to find work. I thought you should know, dear girl. Be careful. I don't trust that man's intentions." The warning sent ice down Lillian's spine. Marcus had left St. Louis, was heading west. It could be coincidence. There was a lot of west to get lost in, but Lillian didn't believe in coincidence, not where Marcus was concerned. "He's looking for me," she said flatly, showing Colt the letter that evening. "He didn't hire an investigator. He's coming himself." Colt read the letter twice, his expression growing grimmer with each pass. "He doesn't know exactly where you are," he pointed out. "St. Louis to Wyoming is a big search area. You could be in Kansas, Colorado, Nebraska, anywhere along the western routes. But if he asks the right questions, traces the route I took." Lillian's voice trailed off as fear clawed at her throat. "I was careful, but I wasn't invisible. Someone might remember me. Someone might point him this direction." "Then we prepare," Colt said decisively. "We make sure everyone in Copper Springs and the neighboring ranches knows to watch for a stranger asking questions about you. We keep you close to the ranch when possible, and we make damn sure that if Marcus Webb does show up, he finds out real quick that you're not alone anymore." The next day, Colt called a meeting with his men and explained the situation in blunt terms. "Mrs. Mercer's stepfather may come looking for her," he said, his voice carrying the authority that made his men respect him. "Man named Marcus Webb, somewhere around 50, brown hair going gray, probably well dressed for a man traveling. If anyone comes around asking about a woman matching Lillian's description, I want to know immediately. Don't engage, don't give information, just come find me. Understood?" Dutch spoke for all of them. "We'll keep watch, boss. Nobody gets near Miss Lily without going through us first." The protection was touching, but it also highlighted how serious the threat was. Lillian tried to go about her normal routines, but she found herself constantly aware of the horizon, watching for riders who didn't belong. Every unexpected visitor to the ranch made her heart race. Every trip to town felt fraught with danger, Colt noticed, of course. "You can't live like this," he said gently one evening when he found her standing at the window, staring out into darkness. "Constantly afraid, constantly watching. That's not living, Leal. That's just existing. I know, she whispered, but I can't help it. Every time I start to relax, I remember that he's out there somewhere looking. And the thought of him finding me, of him taking me back in, he won't. Colt came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. Even if he does find the ranch, even if he does try to claim some right to you, he won't take you anywhere. You're my wife, legally bound. He has no claim on you. And I promise you, Lillian Mercer, I will stand between you and that man, whatever it takes. She leaned back into his strength, drawing comfort from his certainty. I don't want you hurt because of me. I won't be, he assured her. But more importantly, you're worth fighting for. You're worth protecting. Stop thinking of yourself as a burden and start thinking of yourself as someone precious that I'm honored to defend. The words settled into her heart, pushing back the darkness a little. She was precious. She was valued. She was loved. Those truths had to be enough to combat the fear. August brought scorching heat and the hard work of the harvest season. Lillian threw herself into preserving everything they could for winter. Berries, vegetables, fruits traded from neighbors with orchards. The kitchen became a steamy, fragrant workspace where she spent long hours over boiling pots and hot ovens, putting up jars of preserves and pickles that would see them through the cold months ahead. She was elbow deep in bread dough one afternoon when she heard horses approaching at speed. Not the casual pace of ranch hands returning from work, but the urgent gallop of someone bringing news. Her hands still illed in the dough, and she moved to the window just as Jake Sullivan pulled up, shouting for Colt. Colt emerged from the barn at a run, and Lillian watched them confer, saw Colt's expression darken, saw him glance toward the house with something that looked like worry. Then he was striding toward the kitchen, Jake following, and Lillian knew before he spoke that her worst fears had materialized. Stranger in town asking questions, Colt said without preamble. Matches Marcus's description, told the storekeeper he was looking for a stepdaughter who ran away. Young woman, dark hair, traveling alone, said she was mentally unwell and he was trying to bring her home to family who could care for her. The lie was so smooth, so believable. Lillian could imagine how it had sounded to townspeople who didn't know better. A concerned stepfather searching for a troubled young woman. Who wouldn't want to help reunite such a family? What did they tell him? Lillian's voice came out steadier than she felt. Nothing yet, Jake said. Mr. Henderson at the bank got suspicious when the man couldn't provide much detail about you. Said his stepdaughter was shy and quiet, but couldn't describe what she might have been wearing or what possessions she'd have with her. Henderson, smart enough to know that don't add up. He told the man he hadn't seen anyone matching that description and suggested he try the next town north. Sent his boy to us as soon as the man left. He'll be back, Lillian said with certainty. Marcus doesn't give up that easily. If he thinks I'm in this area, he'll search every ranch, every homestead. He'll find me eventually. Then we make sure he finds you on our terms, Colt said grimly. Jake, I want you and Michael to ride into town. Stay visible, keep your ears open. Find out where this man's staying and what his plans are. Dutch, Tommy, I want extra watch tonight. Nobody comes onto this property without us knowing. Lillian. He turned to her, his expression softening. You stay in the house. Don't go out to the barn or the garden or anywhere you'd be visible from the road. Can you do that for me? She wanted to argue, wanted to insist she wouldn't hide in her own home. But the memory of Marcus's hands on her, his threats, his absolute certainty that she belonged to him, that memory was enough to make her nod. I'll stay inside, she agreed. But Colt, if he comes here, if he finds us, then he'll find out what it means to threaten a man's wife. Colt finished, his voice cold as winter steel. I won't start violence, Leal, but I'll damn sure finish it if he brings it to our door. The waiting was agony. Lillian went through the motions of preparing dinner, but her hands shook and she kept burning things, distracted by every sound from outside. Colt stayed close, checking and rechecking his rifle, cleaning his sidearm, preparing for a confrontation he hoped wouldn't come, but refused to be unprepared for. Jake and Michael returned after dark with grim news. Marcus had taken a room at the boarding house and had spent the afternoon asking questions in the saloon, subtle at first, then increasingly direct as alcohol loosened his tongue. He'd mentioned that his stepdaughter had stolen money from him before running away, that she was prone to lying and manipulation, that anyone harboring her could be charged as an accessory to theft. "It's all lies," Lillian said desperately. "I didn't steal anything. I barely got out with my own belongings." "We know," Colt said firmly. "Everyone who matters knows. Marcus can spin whatever story he wants, but you're a respected member of this community now. People know you. They won't believe his slander." But the doubt lingered. What if they did believe him? What if Marcus was convincing enough, smooth enough, that he turned people against her? What if the law got involved and she had to prove she hadn't stolen, hadn't done anything wrong? Sleep that night was impossible. Lillian lay in their bed listening to Colt's breathing, knowing he wasn't asleep either, despite his stillness. Outside, Dutch and Tommy kept watch, dark shapes moving against darker night. The moon was full, at least hard for anyone to approach unseen in that silver light. The attack came at dawn. Lillian woke to shouting and the sound of horses, multiple riders approaching fast. She bolted upright just as Colt was already out of bed, rifle in hand, moving toward the window. In the grey pre-dawn light, she could see 3 men on horseback galloping toward the house. And the one in front, even at this distance, even after months apart, was unmistakably Marcus Webb. "Stay here," Colt ordered, already moving toward the door. "Lock it behind me. Don't come out until I say Colt." But he was gone, thundering down the stairs, and Lillian heard the front door slam. She rushed to the window in time to see him step onto the porch, rifle raised, as Dutch and Tommy converged from the bunkhouse and barn. Jake and Michael appeared from wherever they'd been keeping watch, and suddenly Marcus's 3 riders were facing 5 armed men who looked more than ready to use their weapons. Marcus pulled up short, his hired muscle flanking him uncertainly. In full daylight, he looked older than Lillian remembered, harder, his face twisted by anger and something that might have been desperation. His clothes were travel-worn, his horse leathered from hard riding. This wasn't a carefully planned approach. This was a man at the end of his rope, making one last desperate grab at control. "Lillian," Marcus shouted toward the house. "Lillian Hayes, I know you're in there. Come out here right now. Mrs. Mercer doesn't answer to you." Colt's voice rang out cold and absolutely steady. "You're trespassing on private property. Turn around and leave while you still can." "Mrs. Mercer," Marcus's laugh was ugly. "That girl can't legally marry without my permission. I'm her guardian. Whatever ceremony you went through means nothing." "She's coming with me." "She's 23 years old," Colt countered. "She doesn't need anyone's permission. Our marriage is legal and recorded with the territory. You have no claim on her. She stole from me." Marcus was losing his composure now, his voice rising. "Took money that wasn't hers. That's a criminal matter. I can have the sheriff." "The only criminal matter here is you trespassing with armed men," Colt interrupted. "And we both know Lillian didn't steal a damn thing. She ran from a man who abused her, who tried to force himself on her. That's not theft. That's survival." Marcus's face flushed dark red. "You don't know what you're talking about. That girl is a liar and a manipulator. She probably fed you all kinds of stories to get you to marry her, but I know the truth. She's mentally unstable, prone to delusions. The only delusion here is yours if you think you're leaving with her," Colt said flatly. He raised the rifle a fraction higher, and Dutch and the others followed suit. "You've got one chance, Webb. Turn around right out. Go back to wherever you came from and forget you ever had a stepdaughter. Because if you try to take her, if you even try to set foot on this porch, you'll find out exactly how we handle threats in Wyoming territory." For a long moment, the tension was so thick Lillian could barely breathe, watching from the window. Marcus's hands twitched toward his own gun, and she saw his hired men shift nervously, clearly reassessing whether whatever he was paying them was worth dying for. Then Marcus made his final mistake. "Lillian," he shouted again, his voice cracking, "if you don't come out here right now, I'll tell everyone what you really are. I'll tell them how you seduced me, how you tried to break up your father's marriage, how he didn't get to finish." Lillian had heard enough. She unlocked the bedroom door, ran downstairs, and burst onto the porch before Colt could stop her. She was wearing only her nightgown with a shawl thrown over it, her hair wild around her shoulders. but she'd never felt more powerful than she did in that moment. "You want to tell them what I really am, Marcus?" she called out, her voice ringing clear across the yard. "Then tell them the truth. Tell them how you cornered me in hallways, how you put your hands on me when my father wasn't looking, how you threatened to hurt him if I told anyone. Tell them how I had to run in the middle of the night because I was terrified you'd force yourself on me. Tell them the truth." Marcus's face went from red to white. "You're lying." "I'm not lying, and you know it." Lillian stepped forward to stand beside Colt, feeling his presence like a shield at her back. "You know exactly what you did, what you tried to do, and you know that's why I ran. Not because I stole from you, not because I'm mentally unstable, because you're a predator who saw me as prey. But I'm not prey anymore, Marcus. I'm not that frightened girl you could intimidate and threaten. I'm Lillian Mercer, and I have a husband who loves me, a home where I'm valued, and a community that has my back. You have no power here. You have nothing." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Marcus stared at her with an expression that cycled through rage, shame, desperation, and finally defeat. He'd lost, and he knew it. Whatever hold he'd thought he had, whatever power he'd believed he could still wield, it had evaporated in the face of Lillian's refusal to be ashamed or afraid. "Get off my land," Colt said quietly. "Don't come back. Don't write. Don't send investigators or lawyers or anyone else. Lillian doesn't exist to you anymore. And if I hear you've been spreading lies about her, if I hear you've tried to contact her in any way, I'll come find you myself. And that's a promise, not a threat." For a moment, Lillian thought Marcus might try something desperate. His hand still hovered near his gun, his face contorted with impotent fury. But his hired men were already backing their horses away, clearly done with whatever this was. And without them, Marcus was just one middle-aged man facing 5 armed cowboys who looked eager for him to give them an excuse. Finally, Marcus jerked his reins, wheeling his horse around. "This isn't over," he spat. "Yes," Lillian said firmly, "it is." She watched him gallop away, his hired men following, dust rising in their wake until they disappeared over the horizon. Only when they were truly gone did she allow herself to sag against Colt, her legs suddenly weak, her whole body trembling with reaction. "You were supposed to stay inside," Colt said, but there was no anger in his voice, only awe and something like pride. "I know," Lillian managed, "but I needed him to hear it from me. I needed to tell him myself that he has no power over me anymore." "You were manic," Dutch said, coming up onto the porch. "Pardon my language, Mrs. Mercer, but that was the bravest damn thing I've ever seen." The others murmured agreement, and Lillian felt tears prick her eyes. But these were good tears, tears of relief and release, and the overwhelming joy of standing her ground and surviving. Colt sent Jake and Michael into town to report Marcus's threats to the local sheriff to make sure there was an official record in case he tried to cause trouble through legal channels. But as the day wore on, with no further sign of Marcus, Lillian allowed herself to believe it was truly over. He'd come. He'd lost. He'd left. Whatever power he'd held over her through fear and manipulation had been broken by the simple act of her standing up to him, of speaking truth to his lies. That night, wrapped safely in Colt's arms, Lillian finally felt the last chains of her past life fall away. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness, "for standing with me, for not making me face him alone." "Always," Colt promised, kissing her forehead. "For as long as I live, you'll never face anything alone again." And in that moment, Lillian knew with absolute certainty that she'd found what she'd been searching for when she stumbled up to his gate all those months ago. Not just shelter or safety or escape from danger, but home. True home. The kind built on partnership and respect and love that had been tested and proven strong. She'd survived Marcus. She'd survived grief and fear and all the trauma of her past. And now, finally, she could stop just surviving and start truly living. The weeks following Marcus's departure brought a lightness to the ranch that everyone could feel. It was as if a dark cloud had finally lifted, allowing sunshine to reach corners that had been shadowed too long. Lillian moved through her days with a freedom she'd never known. No longer constantly looking over her shoulder, no longer flinching at unexpected sounds. The fear that had been her constant companion since fleeing St. Louis finally loosened its grip, and she discovered what it meant to simply exist without dread coloring every moment. Colt noticed the change immediately. "You're humming," he observed one morning, coming into the kitchen to find her rolling out pedo, an old hymn her mother used to sing floating unconsciously from her lips. Lillian paused, realizing he was right. "I suppose I am," she said, smiling. "I feel light, like I've been carrying something heavy for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight." He crossed to her, flour dusting his shirt as he pulled her close. "You stood up to your demon and sent him running. You took back your power. That's worth humming about." "Our power," she corrected, reaching up to touch his face. "I couldn't have done it without you. Without all of you." She glanced toward the window where she could see Dutch and Tommy working with horses in the corral, Jake and Michael repairing fence in the distance. These men had stood ready to defend her without question, had treated her threat as their own. That kind of loyalty was something she'd never experienced before, and it humbled her. The legal aftermath of Marcus's confrontation proved anticlimactic in the best possible way. The sheriff in Copper Springs had filed an official report of the incident documenting Marcus's trespassing and threats. The law firm in Kansas City sent word that they'd investigated Marcus's claims about Lillian's father's estate and found them to be largely fabricated. There had been some debts, but nothing that would have required selling the house had Marcus not created additional mortgages without her father's full understanding. Unfortunately, by the time the lawyers got involved, everything had already been liquidated, and Marcus had disappeared with whatever proceeds remained. "I'm sorry," Colt said when the lawyer's letter arrived detailing the findings. "If we'd acted faster, maybe we could have saved something of your father's estate." But Lillian surprised herself by feeling no real grief over the lost property or money. "It's just things," she said, folding the letter carefully. "I have what matters, the memories of my parents before everything went wrong. My mother's shawl and the life I've built here. The rest is just dust. Let Marcus have it if that's what he needs to feel like he won something. I won what actually matters." What she'd won became more apparent as summer faded into autumn and the ranch prepared for winter. The rhythm of the seasons, which had seemed so foreign and challenging when she first arrived, now felt natural and right. She knew without thinking when to start preserving the last vegetables, when to ensure the root cellar was fully stocked, when to begin the endless cycle of preparations that would see them through the cold months ahead. But more than just mastering the practical skills of frontier life, Lillian had found herself. The woman she'd become bore little resemblance to the desperate girl who'd stumbled up to Colt's gate. That girl had been defined by what she was running from. This woman was defined by what she'd built. A marriage based on mutual respect and deepening love, a home that reflected her care and attention, a place in a community that valued her contributions. The community itself had rallied around her after word spread about Marcus's attempt to take her. Far from believing his lies about theft or mental instability, the people of Copper Springs and the surrounding ranches had closed ranks. Mrs. Henderson had made a point of telling Lillian that any man who would try to intimidate a woman the way Marcus had wasn't worth believing about anything. Kate from the saloon had offered, only half joking, to have some of her more colorful customers track Marcus down and teach him a lesson about respecting women. Even the minister had delivered a sermon about protecting the vulnerable and standing against those who would abuse their power. And everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. "You're one of ours now," Ellen Morrison had said simply after church one Sunday. "We protect our own." That sense of belonging settled into Lillian's bones, becoming as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. She'd spent so much of her life feeling displaced, first by her mother's death, then by her father's remarriage, finally by having to flee the only home she'd known. But here on this ranch, with this man and these people, she'd finally found where she was meant to be. Tommy's sweetheart Clara arrived in late September on the afternoon stage, a tiny blonde woman with determined eyes and a carpet bag that held everything she owned. Lillian had insisted Tommy bring her to the main house first thing, ostensibly to meet his employers, but really to give the nervous girl a friendly female face to reassure her that she hadn't made a terrible mistake coming west to marry a man she barely knew. "I know exactly how you feel," Lillian told Clara over tea in the kitchen while Tommy fidgeted anxiously on the porch. I showed up here with nothing, knowing no one, terrified I'd made a horrible choice. But sometimes the biggest risks bring the best rewards. Clara's tension eased slightly. Tommy's letters were so sweet, but letters can lie. Is he really as kind as he seems? Kinder, Lillian assured her. A bit rough around the edges still, but his heart is pure gold. He's been counting down the days until you arrived like a child waiting for Christmas. You'll be good for each other, I think. Just be patient while you both figure each other out. The wedding took place a week later, and Lillian found herself unexpectedly emotional watching Tommy and Clara exchange vows. It had only been 6 months since she and Colt had stood in that same church, making the same promises. But it felt like a lifetime ago. The frightened woman who'd married more out of desperation than hope had been transformed into someone who understood what those vows really meant, choosing to stand with someone through whatever came, building something bigger than either person alone. Thinking about our wedding, Colt murmured, his arm around her waist as they watched Tommy kiss his new bride. Thinking about how far we've come, Lillian replied, leaning into him. How much has changed? How much I've changed into exactly who you were always meant to be, Colt said softly, strong and brave and so damn beautiful. It makes my chest hurt sometimes, just looking at you. She turned to smile at him, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. It wasn't the careful respect of those early days, or even the growing affection of their first months together. This was deeper, the look of a man who'd found his partner in every sense of the word, and knew how rare and precious that was. That night, after the celebration had wound down and they'd returned home, Lillian stood at the bedroom window, looking out over the moonlit prairie. Colt came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the land they'd built a life on. I need to tell you something, Lillian said quietly, her hand coming up to cover his, where it rested on her stomach. She felt him tense slightly. What is it? I'm pregnant. The words came out in a rush, and she felt his sharp intake of breath, the way his arms tightened around her. I wasn't sure until today when I saw the doctor in town. I wanted to be certain before I said anything. About 3 months along, he thinks due in early spring. For a long moment Colt didn't speak, didn't move, and Lillian's heart began to hammer with sudden fear. She knew his history, knew what he'd lost with Sarah. Was he terrified of going through that again? Did he resent her for getting pregnant when they hadn't really discussed children? Did he lie? His voice was rough, thick with emotion. He turned her in his arms, and she saw his face was wet with tears. You sure? We're going to have a baby? Yes, she whispered, her own tears starting. I know it's scary after what happened with Sarah, and I understand if you're up. I'm terrified, he admitted, pulling her close. I'm absolutely terrified. But I'm also so damn happy I can barely breathe. Another chance, Lillian. Another chance at the family I thought I'd lost forever. They held each other in the moonlight, both crying, both laughing, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of this new chapter beginning. Eventually, Colt pulled back enough to place his hand gently on her still flat stomach, his expression one of wonder and fierce protectiveness. We're doing this differently, he said firmly. Doctor's visits every month no matter what. No heavy lifting for you. At the first sign of anything wrong, we're getting you to the best medical care available, even if I have to ride to Denver myself. I won't. His voice cracked. I can't lose you, Lil. I can't. You won't, she said, taking his face in her hands. I'm strong and healthy, and I'm not Sarah. Her tragedy doesn't have to be mine. We'll be careful, we'll be smart, but we're not going to spend the next 6 months living in fear. This baby deserves better than that. We deserve better than that. He nodded slowly, and she could see him consciously choosing hope over fear, faith over worry. It was a choice he'd have to make again and again over the coming months, she knew. But he'd make it because that was who Colt Mercer was, a man who'd learned that the only way through grief was forward, and that sometimes forward meant taking terrifying risks on happiness. The news spread through the ranch and town like wildfire, bringing an outpouring of support that touched Lillian deeply. The ranch wives descended with advice and baby clothes saved from their own children. Kate showed up with an elaborate cradle she'd had in storage, claiming some cowboy had made it for a girl who'd left town before he could give it to her. Dutch, gruff as ever, presented them with a tiny wooden horse he'd carved. Its details so fine it must have taken hours. "Every child needs their first toy," he said, clearing his throat roughly. "Figured I'd get a head start." Even Tommy and Clara, newly married and poor as church mice themselves, showed up with a quilt Clara had been working on. Simple but beautifully made. Each stitch a tiny prayer for the baby's well-being. Winter came early that year, arriving in late October with a fury that tested everyone's preparations. But the ranch was ready, supplies stocked, animals secured, and the main house had never been more comfortable or welcoming. Lillian spent the short, dark days knitting tiny garments and sewing baby clothes, her hands constantly busy while her mind wandered through daydreams of the future. A son with Colt's dark eyes, a daughter with her mother's smile. It didn't matter. Either would be loved beyond measure, raised in a home filled with respect and affection, and the kind of partnership she and Colt had forged. Colt, true to his word, became almost obsessively careful about her health. He wouldn't let her lift anything heavier than a water bucket, insisted she rest in the afternoons, and personally escorted her to monthly doctor visits, regardless of weather or ranch demands. At first his hovering drove her slightly mad, but gradually she recognized it for what it was. Not a lack of faith in her strength, but the actions of a man terrified of losing something precious. So she let him fuss, let him worry, and gently redirected his anxiety into preparing the nursery. That room, the one that had been meant for his child with Sarah, became a project they worked on together. They painted the walls a soft yellow that would work for either a boy or girl. They moved in the cradle, first Sarah's carved one that Colt had made, and then Kate's elaborate gift, positioning them side by side. They sorted through the baby clothes that had been donated, washing and folding each tiny garment with care, and slowly, painfully, healing happened in that room. The grief that had been stored there began to transform into hope. The might have been replaced by will be. "Sarah would have liked you," Colt said one evening, as they stood in the nursery doorway looking at their work. "She would have loved how you've brought this room to life, how you've made it about the future instead of the past." "Tell me about her," Lillian requested, not for the first time. She'd learned that Colt needed to talk about Sarah sometimes, needed to keep her memory alive, and far from feeling jealous or threatened, Lillian understood. Sarah was part of his story, part of what made him the man he was. Honoring that didn't diminish what she and Colt had built together. It enriched it. So Colt told her about Sarah's laugh, about how she'd love to dance, even though she was terrible at it, about her fierce determination to make a home on the frontier, despite being raised in Philadelphia society. He told her about their hopes and dreams, about the plans they'd made for the ranch and the family they'd wanted to build. And as he talked, Lillian could see the love he'd had for his first wife and the grief of losing her, but also the peace he'd made with it. "I loved her," he said finally. "I'll always love her. That doesn't just disappear, but I love you too, Lil, in a way that's different, but equally real. Sarah was my first chance at happiness. You're my second chance. And in some ways, that makes it even more precious because I know how rare it is, how easily it could have been lost." "I love you too," Lillian said, taking his hand. "And I'm grateful every day that I had the courage to walk up to your gate instead of keep running. That you looked at a desperate woman and saw someone worth taking a chance on." Christmas came with a fresh blanket of snow and a warmth inside the house that had nothing to do with the fires blazing in every hearth. They hosted a gathering on Christmas Eve. All the ranch hands, Tommy and Clara, even Dutch, who claimed to hate holidays but showed up anyway. They ate roast beef and potatoes and the pies Lillian had spent days preparing. They sang carols badly and enthusiastically, and Dutch told stories about winters past that were probably half lies but wholly entertaining. At midnight, when everyone had finally left or stumbled off to the bunkhouse, Colt and Lillian sat alone by the dying fire. Her pregnancy was showing now, a gentle swell that fascinated and terrified him in equal measure. He kept his hand on her belly, feeling for the flutters of movement that had started a few weeks before. "There," Lillian said, pressing his hand more firmly against where the baby was kicking. "Feel that?" Wonder spread across Colt's face. "That's real," he breathed. "That's our child, a real person growing inside you." Very real, Lillian agreed with a laugh, and getting more energetic every day. I think we're going to have our hands full. Good, Colt said firmly. I want our hands full. I want noise and chaos and all the mess and joy that comes with children. Plural. If you're willing, I'd like a whole house full. Let's see how we manage with one first, Lillian suggested. But she was smiling. A house full of children growing up on this ranch, with space to run and work to keep them grounded, and two parents who loved each other and would love them. It was a future she'd never dared imagine 6 months ago, but now it felt not just possible, but inevitable. The new year arrived with bitter cold and a blizzard that kept everyone confined indoors for 3 days. Lillian used the forced inactivity to finally sort through the box of things that had arrived from Kansas City, items from her father's house that the lawyers had managed to salvage before everything was sold. There wasn't much. Some photographs, her mother's wedding ring, a few books, a small painted portrait of Lillian as a child that her mother had commissioned. She cried over the photographs, over the evidence of happier times before grief and bad choices had torn everything apart. But the tears were cleansing rather than bitter, mourning what was lost while acknowledging that she'd built something better from the ruins. Your father would be proud of you, Colt said, sitting beside her as she looked through the memories of what you've survived, what you've built, the woman you've become. I hope so, Lillian said softly. I hope he found peace at the end. Hope he knew I didn't leave because I didn't love him. I just couldn't stay and survive. He knew, Colt assured her. Mrs. Patterson's letter said his last words were of you, hoping you'd found safety. That's a father's love, Lil. Wanting his child safe and happy, even when he couldn't provide it himself, she put the photographs away carefully, along with her mother's ring, which she slipped onto her right hand. The past deserved to be honored, but it didn't need to dominate the present. She had a future to prepare for, a child coming in just a few months, a life that was rich and full and more than she'd ever thought possible. February brought the first signs of spring, earlier thaw, longer days, the promise of renewal. It also brought Lillian's labor, arriving 2 weeks earlier than expected on a blustery morning when Colt had just ridden out to check on early calves. Dutch found her in the kitchen, gripping the table and breathing through a contraction, and immediately sent Tommy riding hell-bent for leather to find Colt and fetch the doctor from town. You're going to be fine, Miss Lily, Dutch said with far more confidence than he probably felt, helping her upstairs. Women have been having babies since the dawn of time. Your body knows what to do. Easy for you to say, Lillian gasped between contractions. You're not the one. She broke off as another wave of pain hit, and Dutch's weathered face creased with sympathy and helplessness. Colt arrived before the doctor, bursting into the bedroom, white-faced and terrified. Lillian, I'm fine, she managed, though fine was perhaps overstating it, but this baby has decided today's the day, so you'd better. Another contraction cut her off, and she gripped Colt's hand hard enough to make him woes. The doctor arrived an hour later to find labor progressing normally, if faster than expected for a first baby. He shooed Colt from the room over his protests, but Lillian called him back. No, she said firmly, he stays. I need him here. The doctor looked dubious, but didn't argue with a woman in labor, and Colt positioned himself at Lillian's head, letting her grip his hands, murmuring encouragement and love and promises that they'd get through this together. Hour after hour he stayed, his face betraying his terror every time she cried out, but his voice remaining steady, his presence unwavering. As sunset painted the windows golden red, their daughter entered the world with a furious wail that announced her displeasure at the entire process. The doctor placed her on Lillian's chest, tiny and perfect and absolutely real, and Lillian looked down at this miracle they'd created and felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. She's perfect, Colt breathed, his finger tracing their daughter's impossibly small hand. Lillian, she's absolutely perfect. Hope, Lillian said suddenly, the name coming to her with the same certainty she'd felt when she'd decided to say yes to Colt's proposal. Her name should be Hope, because that's what we built here, hope for the future. Colt's eyes filled with tears. Hope Mercer, he said, testing the name. I like it. I like it very much. The doctor finished his work and declared both mother and baby healthy. giving Colt stern instructions about Lillian's recovery period before packing up his things. Dutch and the others crowded in briefly to meet the newest member of the ranch family, each one looking awkward and odd, holding the tiny infant before hastily passing her to the next person, like she was made of glass. That night, with Hope sleeping in the cradle beside their bed and Lillian exhausted but glowing, Colt sat on the edge of the bed just watching them both. The lamplight cast soft shadows, and the house had settled into peaceful quiet after the chaos of the day. "I was so scared," he admitted quietly. "When Tommy came to get me, when I rode back, not knowing what I'd find. I was back there 5 years ago, terrified history was repeating itself. But it didn't," Lillian said, reaching for his hand. "We're both here, both fine. Hope is healthy and strong and clearly has opinions about things already based on how loudly she announced her arrival." Colt laughed, the sound relieved and joyful. "She's going to keep us on our toes, I think." "Just like her father," Lillian teased, then grew more serious. "Colt, I know you're still scared. I know every time Hope cries or gets sick or has any little thing wrong, you're going to remember losing Sarah and your son, but you can't parent from a place of fear. We have to trust that we'll handle whatever comes together the way we've handled everything else." "When did you get so wise?" he asked, bringing her hand to his lips. "When I married a man who taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's moving forward despite it." She replied, "You've been teaching me that since the moment you offered marriage to a desperate stranger at your gate. Now I'm just returning the lesson." Spring unfurled across the prairie in waves of green and gold, bringing new life to the land and new routines to the ranch. Hope proved to be a relatively easy baby, content to sleep in a basket, while Lillian worked or be passed around to whoever had free hands when she needed attention. The men took turns holding her with varying degrees of competence. Dutch was surprisingly good at getting her to sleep. Tommy made her laugh, and the Sullivan brothers treated her like she was made of porcelain and might shatter at any moment. "She's tougher than she looks," Lillian assured them, amused by their anxiety. "Frontier babies have to be." Clara, now visibly pregnant herself, became a frequent visitor, and she and Lillian would sit together in the afternoons, Lillian nursing Hope while Clara knitted, and they talked about everything from the practical challenges of washing diapers to their dreams for their children's futures. A friendship had formed between them, built on shared experiences and mutual support, and Lillian was grateful for it. The community of women she'd found here was nothing like the competitive, judgmental society she'd known in St. Louis. Here, women helped each other survive and thrive because they understood that frontier life was hard enough without tearing each other down. By the time summer arrived, Hope was 3 months old and thriving. She had Colt's dark eyes and Lillian's delicate features, and she seemed fascinated by everything around her: the horses, the dogs that roamed the property, the chickens that wandered past her basket when Lillian brought her outside. She rarely cried except when hungry or tired, and she developed a habit of making little cooing noises when content that melted even Dutch's crusty heart. "This child is going to be spoiled rotten," Lillian observed one evening, watching Colt make ridiculous faces to get Hope to smile. "Every man on this ranch treats her like a princess." "She is a princess," Colt replied without taking his eyes off his daughter. "Princess of the Mercer Ranch, and we're all her loyal subjects." Lillian laughed, but warmth bloomed in her chest, watching them together. Colt was an attentive, devoted father, the kind who changed diapers without complaint, walked the floor with a fussy baby at 2 in the morning, and constantly marveled at each tiny developmental milestone, as if Hope were the first baby in history to grasp a finger or track movement with her eyes. One afternoon in late June, a writer appeared on the horizon, not unusual in itself, as they had regular visitors now that Lillian had established the ranch as a place of hospitality. But as the writer drew closer, Lillian recognized the figure and felt her heart skip. It was Mrs. Patterson, her father's neighbor from St. Louis, looking travel-worn but determined. "Mrs. Patterson." Lillian hurried out to greet her, genuinely shocked. "What are you doing here? How did you even find us?" The older woman dismounted stiffly, clearly not accustomed to long rides. "Your lawyers gave me the address when I explained I had information you'd want," she said. Information I couldn't trust to a letter. Colt had emerged from the barn, assessing the visitor with cautious eyes, and Lillian quickly made introductions before ushering Mrs. Patterson inside. Over tea and cake, the older woman explained her journey. After Marcus left town, I did some investigating of my own, Mrs. Patterson said. Favors, asked questions, talked to your father's banker. Lillian, dear, your father didn't leave you destitute. There was an account, a trust your mother had set up before she died, meant for you. Your father never touched it, and Marcus either didn't know about it or couldn't access it because it was in your name alone. Lillian's cup clattered against the saucer. A trust. How much? Nearly $3,000, Mrs. Patterson said, producing papers from her bag. Your mother must have been saving for years. The bank has been holding it, waiting for you to claim it. I brought the papers. You'll need to sign them and send them back, but the money is yours. $3,000. It was a fortune, enough to expand the ranch significantly or save for Hope's future or any number of things. But more than the money itself, it was a gift from her mother, a final act of love reaching across the years, ensuring that no matter what happened, Lillian would have something of her own. My mother, Lillian whispered, tears streaming down her face. She was protecting me even then, planning for a future she wouldn't live to see. She loved you very much, Mrs. Patterson said gently. I remember her talking about this trust. She said every woman needed something that was hers alone, something no man could take. She wanted to make sure you had that security no matter what. Colt's hand found Lillian's shoulder, squeezing gently. Your mother was a wise woman. Mrs. Patterson stayed for 3 days, delighting in meeting Hope and hearing about the life Lillian had built. Before she left, she pulled Lillian aside for a private word. I want you to know your father loved you, she said. He was weak and he made terrible choices, but he loved you. In the end, he knew what Marcus was, knew what you'd run from. He just didn't have the strength to fight it. But he'd be so proud of you now, seeing what you've made of yourself. Thank you, Lillian said, hugging the older woman. Thank you for everything, for caring for my father, for bringing me this news, for making the journey here. It means more than I can say. After Mrs. Patterson left, Lillian and Colt spent long evenings discussing what to do with the unexpected windfall. Part of it would go to expanding the ranch, buying more cattle, improving the irrigation system, perhaps building a larger barn. Part would be saved for Hope's future and for the other children they hoped to have. But a portion, they decided, would go to helping others the way Lillian had been helped. There are other women like I was, Lillian said, running from bad situations, desperate for safety and a fresh start. We could offer them what you offered me: work, shelter, a chance to rebuild their lives. Not everyone needs a marriage proposal, she added with a smile, but everyone needs a place to catch their breath and remember who they are beneath the trauma. Colt considered this, then nodded slowly. We'd need to build another cabin, maybe 2, have space for women to stay while they figure out their next steps. And we'd need to be careful. Make sure word gets to the right people, women who genuinely need help, rather than those looking to take advantage. Kate would help with that. Lillian said she sees everyone who passes through town, hears all the stories. She'd know who needs help and who doesn't. Over the following months, the plan took shape. They built 2 small but comfortable cabins on the far side of the ranch, each with a stove, a bed, and basic furnishings. Word spread carefully through the network of women in the territory. If you needed help, if you were running, if you needed a place to start over, the Mercer Ranch would take you in. No questions about your past, no judgment, just work and shelter and time to heal. The first woman arrived in August, referred by Kate. She was younger than Lillian had been, barely 20, fleeing a violent husband who'd broken her arm and threatened worse. She stayed for 6 weeks, working in the kitchen and garden, slowly losing the haunted look in her eyes. When she left, it was to take a position as a teacher in a town 2 territories away, far from her husband's reach, with a letter of recommendation from Lillian and enough money saved to get started. The second came in September, an older woman whose grown sons had tried to force her into a marriage she didn't want so they could control her property. She stayed through the winter, helping with Hope and teaching Lillian advanced sewing techniques. By spring, she'd filed legal papers protecting her rights and returned home ready to fight for what was hers. Each woman who passed through left something behind: stories, skills, gratitude, and proof that healing was possible, that starting over was worth the risk, and each one added to the tapestry of community that Lillian and Colt were building. A place where people took care of each other because everyone understood what it meant to need help. By the time Hope celebrated her first birthday, the ranch had become something more than just a cattle operation. It was a haven, a place where people, especially women, could find not just work, but belonging, not just shelter, but transformation. The main house was often full of voices and laughter, and the dinner table regularly seated 8 or 10 people rather than just family. "This is what I wanted when I asked you to marry me," Colt said one evening, watching Hope toddle after one of the dogs, while 3 women who were currently staying at the ranch worked on mending in the parlor. "Not just a wife to keep house, but a partner to build something meaningful with. You've taken what could have been just a business arrangement and turned it into something that matters." "We did it together," Lillian corrected, leaning against him. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, without your willingness to take a chance on me, without your support and everything I've wanted to try, without your love." He kissed the top of her head. "Best decision I ever made, proposing to a stranger at my gate. Best decision I ever made, saying yes," Lillian replied. As the sun set over the Wyoming prairie, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Lillian stood on the porch of the house that had become her home and reflected on the journey that had brought her here. A year and a half ago, she'd been terrified and desperate, with nothing but the clothes on her back and hope she barely dared acknowledge. Now she had a husband who loved her as an equal, a daughter who filled her days with joy, a home that reflected everything she valued, and a purpose that extended beyond her own survival. The memory of Marcus's threats and her father's death still stung sometimes, but the pain had dulled to something manageable, incorporated into her story rather than defining it. She'd survived trauma and grief and fear, and on the other side, she'd found not just safety, but true happiness, the kind built on solid foundations of mutual respect and shared purpose and love that had been tested and proven strong. "Mama," Hope called from the yard, her word for Lillian still new and thrilling every time she said it. "Mama, look." Lillian laughed, watching her daughter point excitedly at a butterfly that had landed nearby. This child would grow up knowing nothing but love and security, would never understand what it meant to be afraid in her own home. That was Lillian's gift to her daughter, the childhood she herself had lost, preserved and protected through the choices she'd made and the life she'd built. Colt came out to join her, wrapping his arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about? About how far we've come?" Lillian said the same answer she'd given at Tommy's wedding, but with even deeper meaning now. "About how that day I walked up to your gate was the day my real life began. Everything before was just prologue." "And now," Colt asked, "now we write the rest of the story?" Lillian said, smiling up at him. "Together." As twilight settled over the ranch, Lillian called Hope inside for dinner, laughing as the toddler protested, leaving her butterfly. The women staying in the cabins would join them soon, and Clara and Tommy were riding over with news that Clara's baby had finally arrived, a boy they'd named after Dutch, to the old cowboy's gruff pleasure. The table would be full, the house warm with voices and laughter, the future stretching ahead full of possibility. Lillian Hayes had come to this ranch looking for work, and she'd found so much more. She'd found home, purpose, love, and the strength she'd always possessed, but never known she had. She'd transformed from a woman defined by what she was running from into a woman defined by what she was running toward. A future of her own making, built on courage and choices and the unwavering belief that she deserved happiness. Standing at the threshold of her home, with her family around her and her community embracing her, Lillian finally understood what Colt had meant that first day when he'd said he didn't need a servant. He'd needed a partner, and she'd needed to become exactly who she was always meant to be. Not someone who served, but someone who stood tall beside the person she loved, building something that mattered with every choice, every day, every moment. The door closed behind them, shutting out the darkening prairie and enclosing them in warmth and light and love. Outside, the stars began to appear one by one, each a small light against vast darkness. Inside, Lillian Mercer held her daughter close and smiled at her husband across the dinner table and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The story that had begun with desperate words at a wooden gate, "I'm looking for work," had become something neither of them could have imagined. Not a tale of rescue or salvation, but of two people choosing each other day after day, building a partnership that transformed them both. And that, Lillian thought, as Hope giggled and Colt's eyes met hers across the crowded, chaotic